Welcome back. This is great to have you here, and we're gonna go straight to our keynote, and I'm gonna ask Jay Rosen to introduce Matt. So, Jay.
I'm gonna do this Saturday Night Live style. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Thompson.
Hello. So 15 years ago, my friend Robin Sloan and I created this little short film that came to be called Epic 2014. The anniversary of this little movie is one of the occasions that brought me to this podium today, and thank you to Rosenthal and the University of Texas for including me. This is such a special event. I've always described Epic as a brief history of the media set 10 years in the future. And so now it's the future. So how did we do? For context, we created the first incarnation of this little video in early 2004, right around the time that a little site called The Facebook opened up to Harvard undergrads. YouTube wouldn't exist for another 3 years, which meant the version of the movie we put online was a Flash movie. It was the first viral thing I ever had a hand in making. It was translated into French and German and Polish and Basque and Chinese and mirrored by sites across the world because that is how people dealt with online video before YouTube came around. I'm going to show just a snippet of it, just a couple minutes, so you get a flavor of it. I don't know if there's a volume. All right. Well, I don't have much to say. This is from the 2015 version of the movie, Epic 2015. As I'll say, we made an updated version a year after the original one launched. We made the updated version just because the movie was moving so fast. We were like, gotta get the news in. Yeah. Yes, we also had a more optimistic ending. Yes, the movie ends.
Unimaginable in an earlier age.
Sorry. Thank you, Mallory. All right, just watch.
It is the best of times. It is the worst of times. In the year 2015, people have access to a breadth and depth of information unimaginable in an earlier age. Everyone contributes in some way, participating to create a living, breathing mediascape. However, the press as you know it has ceased to exist. The Fourth Estate's fortunes have waned. 20th century news organizations are an afterthought, a lonely remnant of a not-too-distant past. The road to 2015 began in the late 20th century. In 1989, Tim Berners-Lee, a computer scientist at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, invents the World Wide Web. Amazon.com is founded in 1994. Its young creator dreams of a store that sells everything. Amazon's model, which will come to set the standard for internet sales, is built on automated, personalized recommendations, a store that can make suggestions. In 1998, two Stanford programmers unleash Google. Their algorithm echoes the logic of Amazon. It treats links as recommendations, and from that foundation powers the world's fastest and most effective search engine. In 1999, a dot-com startup named Pyra Labs unveils Blogger, a personal publishing tool. Friendster arrives on the scene in 2002, and hundreds of thousands of young people rush to populate it with an incredibly detailed catalog of their lives, their interests, and their social networks.
So after this little snippet, Epic goes on to make a number of predictions, all framed as fait accompli. Google combines all of its services, Gmail, Docs, Google News, etc., into the Google Grid, a universal platform that provides a functionally limitless amount of storage space and bandwidth to store and share media of all kinds. Each user selects her own level of privacy. She can store her content securely on the Google Grid or publish it for all to see. The movie goes on to say that Microsoft would buy the then hot social network Friendster. Google and Amazon joined forces, forming Googlezon, and checkmate Microsoft's ambitions with a platform called Epic. Quote, "The evolving personalized information construct is the system by which our sprawling, chaotic mediascape is filtered, ordered, and delivered. Everyone contributes now, from blog entries to phone cam images to video reports to full investigations. Many people get paid, too, a tiny cut of Googlezon's immense advertising revenue, proportional to the popularity of their contributions." Sound familiar? We updated Epic slightly the next year in 2005, and Apple played a larger role. The interface for Epic 2015, imagine 2 years, I'm proud to say, before the launch of the iPhone, was a hyper-powered mobile device we called the Wi-Fi pod. We got plenty of details wrong in this speculative future, but all that is to say, in the years since Epic was released, we've gotten the same question a few times over. How does it feel to have gotten so much right? I can't speak for Robin, but I have an answer. It feels bad. We did not want to tell the future. This movie was intended to be a warning. The 2014 version ends with this ambiguous statement, but perhaps there was another way. When we showed the movie, we usually followed it up with a conversation about how we might avoid this future. We were working at the Poynter Institute at the time. Every week, journalists would come to learn hallowed secrets from masters of the trade, handed down for generations. No one seemed to be aware or talking about the fact that our world was going to be royally upended. The things that were happening with Google and Microsoft and Friendster and Amazon and what have you were treated as though they were in a domain outside of journalism, and that anyone who really cared about reporting could just put their head in the sand and nosh on that shoe leather and whatever, and they'd just be fine. Just watch out for the cocoa butter cops, because, sand. They were not fine. This is not fine. This is as bad a time for the press and truth in democracy as I think has existed in my lifetime. We teeter on dystopia, an anti-democratic panopticon in which we bartered privacy for commerce and real information for comforting chaos. A billionaire has bankrupted a news organization. A US president now labels the press the enemy of the people. A leaked style book, apparently from a white supremacist website, reflects more social media savvy than the social media guidelines of many news organizations. And a good chunk of the public thinks that journalists did as much as anyone to bring this all about. And so this is what I wanted to spend my talk on. See, there are a few major things that I think we got wrong in Epic 2014 and 2015. First of all, I think we started the clock way too late, and we focused on a technological story at the expense of a political one. Tom Rosenstiel made this point yesterday, but it can't be said enough. By the time Robin and I made this little movie, trust in the press had been steadily withering for decades. The 2000s and 2010s would see that trust shrink to historic lows, but the long trend line was really clear. And yes, this correlates with a broad decline in trust in institutions, but the longer I've been in this profession, the more I think that leaning on that correlation lets us off the hook. I want to make the case that the period taught to me as the golden age of the press was in fact when the seeds of our undoing were laid. That while there is much to learn from that golden age, there is a whole lot to unlearn, and there are a lot of lessons in the era that came before it. I don't believe we can invent the future by looking backwards, but I don't believe we can improve the future unless we have a genuine understanding of our history. So let's take a clear-eyed look at the period before Epic, and then let's brush away the cobwebs of a somewhat deeper past. From the time I began my career, I was told the history of our industry this way. There were the Dark Ages, and then there was Watergate. And that began a golden era of the professional press, when news organizations, flush with cash, aflame with public support, sent correspondents into every nook and cranny of the globe, uncovering injustice, giving voice to the voiceless, and fostering world peace. We all watched Walter Cronkite, who spoke universal and unquestioned truths, and represented everybody. Then USA Today and cable news came along and made everything about photos and weather maps, and soon enough millennials, marking an age to the era of the linotype machine and the pica pole. And what, after all, is public discourse without pica poles, I ask you? Obviously, every journalist of the period would acknowledge problems, but I was definitely told that the late 60s through the early 90s was the golden age of the press. Yet when I started working for news organizations around the country, I more often encountered skepticism just after this golden age from our communities than appreciation. I felt that lack of trust seeping from the public everywhere I went. I could be out in Southwest Fresno, reporting on a predominantly black neighborhood that was thrilled because they were getting an ATM, the first access to banking services they had since the neighborhood dried up after being cut off from downtown by a highway. Thanks, redlining and white flight. And people would look at me like, we don't see none of you around here too often. And they meant journalists, by the way. Every city I worked in had a different pejorative nickname for its newspaper. I grew up with the Orlando Slantinal. The Fresno B was sometimes the Fresno D- or the Fresno E for effort. In Minneapolis, when I worked at the Star Tribune, people from the area would say, "Oh yeah, you're working for the Red Star now, are you?" The Red Star, that's the one I want to stick with. When I brought these nicknames back to my elders in the newsroom, this is the defense they tried to arm me with. We get it from both sides. Both sides. The naivete and arrogance embedded in that defense is like almost heartwarming, to use a Southern compliment. It's like, bless your heart, no wonder no one takes you seriously. You think there are only two sides. And furthermore, you think that earning the enmity of everybody is secretly a long-term strategy for restoring trust. If we just keep pissing them all off, then eventually they will love us again. And the slightly more nuanced strategy of the national press, if we learn to piss a giant portion of them off in a way that leaves the others feeling really self-satisfied, then maybe those others will sign up for memberships. The Red Star. I wanted to know where the nickname came from, particularly given that any actual would-be socialists among my friends considered the Star Tribune fully an organ of the business class. And so I looked into my paper's history, and I uncovered a media ecosystem from a century prior, from the alleged Dark Ages, that was so unlike anything I've ever encountered in any city in the country. As media scholars, most of you will know this. In the early 20th century, before the advent of television news, newspaper penetration approached 130%. That is, the average household at one point subscribed to 1.3 newspapers. That high water mark was in the 1940s, but I want to take us to a little earlier than that, 1920, almost exactly a century ago. That was the year the Minneapolis Star was born. There were a bunch of papers in the Twin Cities at this time. St. Paul and Minneapolis each had major dailies. There was an Irish Catholic paper, a Jewish paper, a black paper, a Swedish language paper. Minnesota, around the turn of the 20th century, had more than 100 non-English newspapers. But in 1920, the city's first socialist mayor, Thomas Van Leer, had just left office, and he thought there was something missing. There was no outlet that spoke to or for the city's farmer-laborer class. If you know Minnesota, you know the farmers and laborers loom large in state lore. Its extension of the Democratic Party is to this day the Democratic Farmer-Laborer Party, the DFL. So Van Leer teamed up with a local labor journalist named Herbert Gaston, and the two scrapped together some capital to start this newspaper. I'll quote from their founding argument in the first edition of the paper. Right up front, they're responding to the criticism that they intend to make a class publication. A criticism, they say, quote, shows that many persons are unconscious of the fact that almost without exception the existing dailies are themselves class publications of an extraordinarily dangerous and insidious kind, and that all of them are political in their nature and effect. Political policy, industrial policy, social policy shape their editorial expression and tinge and corrupt their news columns. The control over the commercialized city press is a financial control, and financial control is notoriously concentrated, notoriously irreconcilable with the broad public interest. The Star is not to be a class publication, nor are its interests primarily political, they say, but the Star will be political in this sense, that it does not despair of the improvement of political conditions and political institutions. It will stand for the improvement of political institutions and political conditions by political means. It will not seek by lies to alter discontent where discontent is real and well-founded, nor to gloss over and deny evils where genuine evils exist. Primarily, the Star is going to be a newspaper which endeavors to report the news accurately and to give those who have an interesting, pertinent, and sincere opinion to express a chance to express it. In doing that, it will want especially to open its columns to those whose point of view and whose argument or defense has never been presented fairly hitherto. Whatever you think of the Star's founding argument, step back for a moment and consider the media ecosystem here. I've been a journalist in Boston, in St. Pete, Florida, in Fresno, California, in Columbia, Missouri, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in Washington, D.C. I have never lived in a city where the media were truly plural, where the city spoke to and about itself in so many different voices, and when you could choose a paper that spoke to and for you, and use the tools of journalism to create accountability for your polity's interests in the public sphere. I spent some time researching this ecosystem just because I wanted to feel what it was like when the arguments the media gave voice to over the direction of a city were as rich and vibrant as the arguments we now only attend to on the national level in the US. I can tell you it was very different. On the day the Minneapolis Star started publishing, Thursday, August 19th, 1920, the story that got the most ink in the paper was electric streetcar fares. So the Minneapolis Morning Tribune that day, this was like a mildly notable issue, occasioning a brief report that St. Paul was going to act on an expert's recommendation to raise streetcar prices from 5 cents to 6 cents. I can just bet you if I spoke to the editors there at that time, they'd be like, listen, we've covered the street fare hike, we all knew this was going to happen, we've been covering it in the run-up to the vote, and we can't dedicate 20 inches to it every day. But to the Minneapolis Star, this was a huge deal. A 20% fare hike that hit lower and middle class workers far harder than the automobile-owning gentry. While the Tribune dispensed with the issue in a few paltry-ish inches, the Star went deep that day on coverage, from straight-ahead news reports to impassioned editorials and columns, and it was back the next day, and you can be sure that it was loud on the issue in the aftermath of the fare hike. It was fascinating to see that particular issue on the front page of that paper that day, because if you go to Minneapolis to this day, you will find that the city's lack of a viable public transit infrastructure outside the very limited light rail is a huge deal, a hindrance both to employers and to residents. And many of those residents will tell you a story that the city once had a thriving electric streetcar system, but that a conspiracy between corrupt politicians and automakers brought an end to those streetcars. Transit scholars will tell you that there are only elements of truth in that story, that the demise of streetcars in the Twin Cities and across the country was a more nuanced, complex issue than even the Star did justice to. But the thing is, reading that coverage, I started to care about this story. I just got a dose of what it would feel like to be in a city that spoke in so many different voices to itself, and it was electrifying. I began to see why people would subscribe to 1.3 newspapers on average. That flora of coverage on the local level represented a far more interesting fight than our endless wranglings over the stasis of federal politics today. If this streetcar thing feels wonky to you, trust that it felt vivid to me. I wanted to keep reading, to see what would happen. I found myself rooting for the Star to dig deeper, to tell us what would happen with the streetcars, to keep up that coverage as private automobiles quickly started to build market share among predominantly white middle-class car owners who didn't need a green book to get around and began to decamp from the city's urban core into suburbs, redesigning the metro area to favor highways and surface parking, severing poor black neighborhoods from the city center and the banking, jobs, and nightlife it contained. But instead, although the Star managed to build an audience, it was frozen out by advertisers from the city's business class and went bankrupt in 1924. There's more than one way for a billionaire to bankrupt a news organization. Big newspapers were nothing if not cash-rich. And like any cash-rich industry, newspapers went on a massive M&A spree over the course of the 20th century during their golden age. The family that owned the Minneapolis Morning Tribune bought the Star, the Minneapolis Times, and the Minneapolis Journal, and in 1982, all the papers get rolled up into my paper, the Star Tribune. I suspect that in every one of those acquisitions, the voice of a distinct paper was dimmed, and the city's media ecosystem became slightly more monocultural. One view of truth, one sense of news judgment, one company with a somewhat expanded subscriber base, but that spoke in less and less clear terms to or for a particular polity. And I bet the business-minded readers of the Minneapolis Morning Tribune did not like it when their paper acquired the Socialist Star. I bet they started to detect a miasma of liberal woolly-headedness infecting their previously sensible breakfast reading, and their coffee tasted more foul as they read the headlines. Oh, see, it's been going downhill ever since they acquired the Red Star. I don't even know if I should keep subscribing. Not incidentally, as all those papers bought each other up in the golden age of the press, as the chains that compose our industry grew larger and larger, it grew more and more possible for a weakened business model to fell hundreds of papers at once. How does this story relate to Epic 2014? If I were to remake that story today, I would have to draw the frame much wider. The road to 2019 did not begin in 1989 when Tim Berners-Lee created the World Wide Web. It did not even begin, I'm sure, after the last Gilded Age when socialist mayors were running cities and starting newspapers. But the road from 2019 must be able to imagine 1920. Envision what it felt like to have media, plural media, that spoke to you and on your behalf. If we've learned too belatedly that advertising is no longer an endless money pump and we're to rebuild an industry on market mechanisms like philanthropy and membership, then we must recognize that this new industry will be built on passion. Our passion for our audiences, their passion for the work we do, a tangible sense that they are caught up in something larger than themselves, and that something is democracy. The public will only support our work if they perceive that doing so is a more effective way of participating in our democracy than sharing something on Facebook. Journalists inculcated in the values of the Golden Age tend to instantly make a few illogical inferences from this point. For example, that I'm arguing for a partisan press. That particular leap reflects the same type of naivete about our politics that marks the both sides defense. If you don't understand at this point that the conflicts within America's political parties are as significant as the conflicts between them, I really don't know what to tell you. Like, have you been following politics? Or people ask if I mean to make journalists advocates. And to that I say journalism inherently involves some advocacy, whether for particular news judgments or for a fair-minded, fact-driven pursuit of truth as the best vehicle for a democratic accountability and progress between elections. We must recognize that as journalists, we are political actors. If you contend that a mutual peace is a precondition for mutual prosperity, that is a political position, and the reverse is as well. If you downplay the strong and striking tension between the two, you're indulging your naivete at the expense of your regard for truth. We are political actors. We share a desire to procure for the public the fullest and fairest airing of relevant truths, but we must understand that the premises we deploy to pursue those truths influence the facts we decide to uncover, the stories we decide to tell, and the perspectives we decide to foreground. If we continue to perceive ourselves as outside the democratic system, the public will increasingly perceive us as detached from it, and therefore irrelevant to it. We can be independent of parties, but we cannot be independent of the public. We must represent the public, and we must be perceived as doing so. And that's why we require an ecosystem. We cannot speak to or for many overlapping polities or equally represent the public's competing interests with one voice. Let me echo a prior panelist this morning, if I can find him, Jim Brady. The days of competition driving action need to end. When I heard Tom's anecdote yesterday about Britt Hume and Peter Jennings editing one another's scripts because they each came from such different political premises, I fully believe that the edits made the script stronger. I also wonder, though, if it didn't mean that over time, Britt Hume felt a little bit less trustable and authentic to white conservative men, and Peter Jennings didn't feel the same to white liberals. When I hear Tony Hale's question about the other 98%, and when I hear Neiman Lab's Josh Benton reminding us what a tiny percentage of media consumption now accrues to journalism, the conclusion that I draw is that journalistic truth is badly losing the attention game. Media has captured a larger and larger share of the public's time, and journalism is capturing less and less. We will not be able to compete with Netflix and Instagram on the grounds of pure entertainment, even if our storytelling is, as it must be, absolutely top-notch. We must recapture a long moribund ability to activate the public's passion for its own democracy by reflecting in ourselves, in many voices, a willingness to both stoke and reflect that passion. If we don't downright excite the public with our work, if we don't tell stories that feel at least as relevant and true as Black Mirror and also have impact in the real world, then we will lose to Black Mirror. I'm here and I'm at the Center for Investigative Reporting because I saw a powerful opportunity to help to cultivate a genuine ecosystem. Right now, so many journalistic resources are going to reporting on the last vanishingly small scrap of competitive terrain. We've got this lopsided situation where hundreds of journalists are eyeing the White House like a hawk, while our 3,000 criminal justice jurisdictions languish in twilight. Can we learn the lessons of the Panama Papers and ICIJ on the domestic scale to cover giant, impossible stories like climate change, mass incarceration, and under-prosecuted financial corruption from 1,000 vantage points? Can we invent a media ecosystem so relevant that 130% of American households see themselves in the news? That would be the best of times. If that's the press you want to build, here I am. Let's build together. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
I feel like I should be interviewing you, Jay.
I have so many things I want to ask you, but when I was researching your career in preparation for this, I realized that if there is one person in American journalism who can do literally everything, it's Matt Thompson. I'm serious. He can do pretty much everything. First thing I want to ask you is, why did you take this job?
My last point speaks to that somewhat. I mean, I have loved The Atlantic, where it was before CIR, for as long as I can remember. And I continue to, and I'm still a contributing editor there, and I still speak at Atlantic Live events all the time. But I felt like there's so many journalists in DC. There's so many journalists covering national politics, the Trump administration from that level. And here's an organization that has a dedicated, the nation's pretty much only, to I could tell, weekly dedicated platform for investigative reporting that exists in communities, 500 public radio stations almost across the country, that has to, by dint of having that strategic asset, collaborate with newsrooms of every size, with journalisms in every place. And that felt like, at this moment, it felt really like where I wanted to be.
Okay. One of the things I heard you saying in your talk is, and I completely agree with this, is every news organization has a politics, whether it admits it or not, whether it knows it or not. So what is going to be the politics of Reveal when you are editor-in-chief?
Well, and I think that every newsroom's actions and judgments are themselves political. Like, we are implicated in the political system. We are a part of it. Political actors try to influence us and try to influence the stories we cover and what have you. And we seek independence from political actors. We cannot, I believe, seek independence from the public. We have to represent the public in some sense. As I think about CIR's work, and as I think about what investigative reporting is and should be, on some level, it's reporting that does a few things. It must be deep enough to help the country understand some of the systemic dynamics of power that the country is wound up in. It must be striving to find stories, important stories about human beings that are on the wrong end of power, and bring those stories for the first time into public view in a masterful way. And I think that ethic, I think for me as a journalist, I want to find the most important stories that are not being told, and then help those stories get told in the most powerful way possible. And I think to say that is inherently political, but I think is also quite democratically astute and right.
The Atlantic, which I know very well, been a subscriber for a long time, been reading it for more than 20 years, in my mind, kind of looks east. It looks towards Europe. Even the name, The Atlantic, it's sort of about that. It points itself to, Reveal, to me, points in a very different direction. California, huge Hispanic population. Seems that you're going to have to look south more, like this conference does, which one of the interesting things about ISOJ is that it's more of a southern-looking, Latin American-influenced conference. So how are you thinking about the geography of your remit at the Center for Investigative Reporting?
Yeah, interestingly, I think one of the, it's funny, like when I started meeting with the team and talking with everybody one-on-one, there's this way that folks have of saying, we've been a lot of different things. Like, there was a moment when CIR merged with The Bay Citizen, which was this outlet that covered the Bay Area. There was a moment when we launched a spin-off site called California Watch, which covered state-level politics. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, we launched Reveal, this public radio show. And those different eras, to some of the journalists are now at CIR from each of those different eras. And what it means is that we have a kind of built-in instinctual value for and expertise in doing city level, state level, national level coverage. And then when you dig back into the deep history of the organization, you find investigations like this investigation called the boomerang chemical. It was like the second story, I think, second big story that came out of the center. And it was about the fact that the EPA and the FDA had been signing off on, they had prohibited these chemicals from use on American farms and American produce, but then those chemicals were getting exported to other countries where produce was being grown to poison those farms and to poison some of the families that tended them. And then the produce would get re-imported to the U.S., which is why they called it the boomerang chemical, that it would the chemicals were banned here, but they'd come back through this back door. I think the ways in which these different levels of coverage are actually deeply interconnected is an important framework for all of us as journalists to bring to the way that we scope and shape stories, no matter what level we're working at. When I was at the Star Tribune, we did a wonderful story called The Money Pipeline from Tijuana, which was about the fact that if you went at the time to Tijuana, Mexico, you would see cars driving around with Minnesota license plates on them because of the interconnections between the two places. We are globally more interconnected and continuously more interconnected than we ever have been before. And I think part of the dynamic of uncovering the deep systemic patterns that underlie why we have gotten to where we are and how we unwind the things that are most harmful to the public is recognizing that.
I really liked in your talk your confession that you saw the future of news as sort of a platform or technology story, but really we should have been thinking of it as a political story. And I want to ask you to expand on that a little bit in this context, and hoping you can make the connection. Marty Baron, as you may know, has tried to sum up his attitude towards the current political crisis by saying, we're not at war, we're at work. What do you think of that attitude?
I would say, I definitely think that it's a good, strong sentiment, and far be it from me to question Marty Baron. I think I think that we're in a different sort of conflict than is typically construed, and this is where the technological sphere really does come into it. I genuinely do think that conflict for attention, the battle for attention, is hugely important. When I say that journalism and truth are losing the attention game on behalf of democracy,
we are in a war.
Absolutely. I think we are fighting for every scrap of the public's attention. We're fighting, I hope, to deserve every scrap of the public's attention that we can. I think it is an astonishing pattern that more and more time and attention has accrued to media, and less time and attention is accruing to journalism. It is those two things signal that we are on the losing end of a war to me. And, framing it as a war, militaristic metaphors get us only so far. I think I completely admire some of the storytelling, the immense fantastic storytelling that this era of high fidelity, luxe, beautiful media has given us. And I think it's important that we as storytellers learn from that, from their techniques and their skills. But I do think that right now, truth is on its heels.
Yeah. One more question, then we'll toss the cube. Another really cool thing about this conference is that it brings together academics and journalists in one community. And I'd love to know from you, in your new role as editor-in-chief at CIR, what kind of research and work from academics would help you do your job? Journalism professors have a lot of latitude over what kind of research they conduct. If they were going to conduct research that would help you do a better job and help the press rise to the moment, what kind of work would that be?
So many things, I think, from just, sending great journalists, great new young emerging journalists our way. But also, so one of the things CIR has done recently was convene with a few scholars something called the Mind to Mind Conference to help connect our reporters with scholars in different domains to have kind of a mutually reinforcing flow of information between the two, and that was really one of our data journalists, Nduja, on the data team, led this effort, and that was really fruitful. I value a lot of time. The fact that you can have a vantage point that is not like crushed by day-to-day 24-hour imperatives means that you can sort of like draw the scope wider. There are also sort of scholarly techniques that I think are really useful, even in understanding the public. I mean, a point that you have made time and time again is that getting a real handle on the interests of the various public polities that are out there is a challenging act. It takes a lot of time and investment, and it takes a lot of tools from ethnography to anthropology to polling to really get a genuinely textured picture of what does the public most truly care about. We do some of that in our reporting, but it should be connected, I think, to a deeper picture, and one that I think our scholars are most equipped to provide.
How are we doing? Who has a question for Matt? We see one right here.
Where? Here.
Oh man, is that the first failure of the catchbox that's happened?
Yes.
Thank you. Patrick Butler with the International Center for Journalists. And Matt, I'm going to start calling you the Meryl Streep of journalism because your accents are so spot on. My question is, I would love to hear you reflect a little bit on something that came up a lot yesterday in terms of losing conservative voters or readers, potential audience, because they perceive us as taking a side, and you've talked about, CIR, if you have a political view, it's going to be representing those who don't have a voice and communities that are not covered very well. When we cover, say, immigrants from Central America or Middle East, or we cover LGBT communities and things like that, we will be perceived as having a bias. Do you worry at all about losing those people?
I worry about having an ecosystem that cannot speak to all of our citizens with facts. I care as much about there being a healthy media ecosystem for folks who come from conservative political premises as any polity that exists. I want that constituency too to see themselves reflected in media and to have journalism that comes from the same values of fairness and accuracy, impartiality, transparency, honesty, independence, completeness, accountability, respect, and excellence that I bring to our work. And I think it will require a really healthy ecosystem, which is not what I think we currently have. And I don't think that genuinely speaking to or for that polity means that it will inherently push those outlets away from stories that the whole nation should pay attention to. It's funny, and this comes in part from having family in southeastern Minnesota that are multi-generation John Deere families, and from having attended an evangelical Christian school for most of my upbringing. But I spoke to a sort of deep red Minnesota voter I know a few weeks back about immigration. I was wrestling with this, about this question. I was wrestling with this question: how does a nation that's ashamed of its leaders, where universally, you walk around the country, we're in the middle of the government shutdown, and it's like everybody's ashamed of the nation's leadership. And so how does a nation that's ashamed of its leaders find pride in itself? And he stepped back for a second, and he said, well, I think it's immigration. I think it's the fact that so many people want to come into the country, and obviously we must be doing something right for so many people to want to join us here. And I said, that's really interesting, because it wasn't an answer that I would have expected. And I said, what do you think about, he said, he elaborated on the point, and he said, I feel like the thing is, you just got to respect the process. And, there are a lot of folks, they're just trying to come over any willy-nilly. My relatives came over here from Germany, and you gotta make sure that you're following the rules and dotting the T's and waiting in line and all that. And I said, that's really interesting, and it's a really unexpected point. I did not expect him to say that immigration is America's beacon to the world. What do you have to say about the argument from many immigration activists at this moment that by moving the ports of entry from the borders to bridges, that it has, and by effectively creating these static queues, that that beacon is effectively being shut off? And we had a really good and interesting conversation about it. And I think that those conversations are still possible. And I think having not one voice but many will really help make those conversations better.
Should we take another?
One last one.
One more question. Who has it?
Any victim for this? Here, you want?
Okay, this is not apropos specifically of the topic, but two very smart journalists. Is Julian Assange a journalist?
Oh, man, you're going to have to handle that one.
30 seconds to respond.
I guess I would just point the question back at you. This question has come up in our industry. In my time in the industry, one of the biggest questions that came up is, are data journalists journalists? Like, we've been asking a lot, are bloggers journalists was another question that came up a lot. We asked that question, like, around the bounds of, like, who is and isn't a journalist so often. And I want to ask more, like, what is journalism? And what does it imply? What does journalism that's done by different people, if we can agree on what journalism is, then what does it imply when different people do it? What does that imply for my work? And what does it imply for our industry and profession?
I want to close with something that you taught me just now, Matt. You said earlier that you can never be independent from the public, which I thought was a really brilliant statement. And it taught me that this has been the problem with professionalization of the press in the United States, is it eventually began to teach people that they could be independent from the public. And I think that's responsible for a lot of the problems that you lit upon in this talk. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Fargo.
Apologies to all the Minnesotans for my awful accent. Thank you, Jay. Thank you again, Rosenthal.
Now, don't have a break. Don't move. Stay there. We're gonna have for the first time a lightning session. So we have a series of speakers. They will speak just for 5 minutes, and I will be here screaming at them. More than 5 minutes. But it's a variety, a miscellaneous. But we're gonna start with very, very good news from Janine Warner and Luis Botelho. Janine Warner is the co-founder of Sembra Media, and Luis Botelho is from the International Center for Journalists. So let's rock and roll. Time is counting.
You can hear me okay? You can't hear me okay? Oh, now you can hear me. Fantastic. I'm just going to give him one more second because we've timed this carefully, and if I do my line before his, it's not fair. I am so excited to be here today with Luis Botelho from ISOJ to announce Velocidad. Some of you have already gotten a glimpse of this. Velocidad is a digital media accelerator designed to help independent journalists in Latin America build more successful businesses. Velocidad aims to strengthen media entrepreneurs with more than $1.5 million in direct investment and consulting support. We learned from many other media accelerators as we designed Velocidad. And our goal is to accelerate media in place, which means we'll send our consultants to them in their countries, and then back that up with virtual support. Our holistic strategy is designed to work with for-profit and nonprofit organizations and to adapt to the broad range of countries we work in.
Velocidad is made possible thanks to a partnership with the International Center for Journalists, Sembra Media, and Luminate. Over the past 3 years, ISOJ has been supporting Sembra Media through its Night Fellowship program. Its co-founder, Janine Warner, who we are glad to work with, has been working, supporting the sustainability of media in Latin America. With this project, we hope to expand, and we are going to expand her fellowship for 2 more years.
I got to run the program.
Our partnership through Velocidad will bring the best experts in the industry in every area, from newsroom management to editorial standards and marketing. In a moment, Felipe from Luminate is going to talk to you more about their investment.
Thank you. With Velocidad, we seek to support media entrepreneurs who aspire to economic independence regardless of their ideological position. We're not political about this. To participate, you do have to be an independent journalist, and your media must be publishing original content in both Spanish or Portuguese. We'll serve all of Latin America, including Brazil. Yes, Rosenthal. We seek digital native media, which means we're looking for media that were born online. And you can learn so much more about this today on velocidad.fund. Velocidad.fund is the new site we just launched a few moments ago.
Velocidad is an ambitious program, one that we believe is going to strengthen the media landscape throughout Latin America. We will do this by helping them diversifying their audiences and expanding their audiences, and at the same time building stronger businesses. Our goal is really to build a vibrant community of journalists, entrepreneurs, as well as organizations that support freedom of the press. All the 3 partners are also committed to share everything we learn across Latin America with Velocidad.
Thank you. At Sembra Media, we've spent the last 3+ years mapping the independent digital media in the region, and we found more than 800 digital media sites that meet our very strict criteria for transparency and independence. You can search them through our interactive directory at sembramedia.org. Many of these sites face censorship, arrests, harassment, and worse. And in the midst of that, they're trying to build business models for new media, which is hard enough even in the best of circumstances, as most of you know. With Velocidad, we seek to support journalists who have created new voices, journalists who are often telling stories that other media are too afraid or too compromised to tell.
We know that the internet is growing fast, that the mobile explosion has brought millions of people online just in the last few years. And they are growing every year. They are looking, there are interests for independent media organizations that could provide information, especially in countries where the media options were very limited. They are hungry for new voices. They are looking for trusted sources of news and information. And also, they want those news organizations to hold government officials accountable. That's why the innovative projects that Velocidad is designed to support are building audiences very quickly. But just as importantly, they are engaging audiences that in many cases were not covered before. Everything from indigenous populations to the LGBTQ community. At ISOJ, we are empowering journalists to tell better stories, and we are also working in the intersection of journalism and technology. We are helping them gain expertise from storytelling to the use of new tools. In my 20 years working for ICFJ, I have never seen a time so innovative and exciting to launch a project like Velocidad. These are very important times. I also would like to note that being here in Austin made me extremely proud and happy for the work that Professor Rosenthal Alves, a good dear friend, has done through the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas. I remember.
Yeah, we have to cut. We're going long. We're going long.
I remember being here 20 years ago just brainstorming about this.
So I will end with just two last things, I promise. First, I have to acknowledge that my co-founder, Michal Istrebner, is here in the audience, and she will give many more details about how to apply and how the program works in the colloquial on Sunday. And I will just leave you this. We created Velocidad because journalists need more than money. Don't get me wrong. They need the money, and we have more than $1 million for them. But they also need help with management, with technology, with diversifying revenue, without compromising their ethics. And OMG, don't forget the accountant. You all forget the accountants. That makes it really hard when somebody audits you to try and shut you down as a government. Please help us share this message. Help us share this new website. Be our consultants, be our partners, be our next investors. Thank you.
We'll wait for you. Gracias.
Hello, hello. Yes, can you hear me? Yes. Good afternoon. I'm Latino like that. I need a response. Rosenthal's gonna count me on time for this, but I couldn't stand on the stage without honoring him and thanking him. Much has been said about what ISOJ and him has accomplished in the past 20 years. But one thing I want to especially highlight is your contribution to the Latin American independent media ecosystem. So just hand to Rosenthal for all he's done for Latin American media. As Rosenthal was saying, my name is Felipe Estefan. I'm the director of Luminate. You may know me from such things as Velocidad. You may also know me from our previous name, which was Omedia Network's Governance and Citizen Engagement team. My talk and the time that I have left is devoted to explain why betting on media is something worth doing. But then as I was preparing it, I realized that most people in this room would already believe that it was something worth doing. So I've decided to instead split my time in two different things. One is to rant about all of the people that disagree with us, and I hope you'll cheer me on as I do that. And the second part is to tell you how we are at Luminate investing in case that you're interested in partnering with us. So if you're like me and spend a lot of time talking about money and how to bring money into media, you probably at some point will have heard a sentence that looks like this: investing in media is a waste of money. Journalists will never know how to run a business. A media business is a dying business. Journalism is doomed. And my all-time favorite, journalism produces no returns. And when I hear these things, I feel a little bit at first like this. And then I feel a little bit more like this. And I really question, I say, really? Really? Journalism produces no returns? And I can tell you, as someone who grew up in Bogota, Colombia, who sees the role that journalists are playing in my country to be able to tell the stories of how violence is affecting vulnerable populations, the idea that journalism produces no returns is just something absolutely crazy to me. And I think of that when I hear other stories. I know for a fact that investing in media is a bet worth making when I hear about the work that Luz Meli Reyes and the folks at Efecto Cocuyo are doing in Venezuela to highlight, yes, they are working in very challenging environments to be able to bring to light what is happening and the everyday struggles of Venezuelans today. I know for a fact that that's an investment worth making. I think that way when I see Pablo sitting here and Olivia sitting here from Chequeado, as I think about the way that they're raising the cost of lying, but also the way that they're using technology and automation to make sure that their work reaches more and more people. The work that they've done, for example, with GIFs, to try to bring fact checks to more Argentinian people is one that I know for a fact is an investment worth making, because also this is the kind of thing I like to fund. Or when I think about the work of Renata Rizzi and Paola Miraglia at Nexo, as they are building a sustainable business by experimenting on membership models, I know that that's an investment worth making. And so I think, as I think about this, and I hope you'll agree, I know that investing in independent media is not only a moral imperative, but it is the smart thing to do. And that the way that we think about returns when investing in independent media can't solely be focused on how large commercial returns will be and how quickly we can get them, but an understanding of returns that goes beyond that, that understands that social impact is also an important return, and that building sustainable businesses that can have an outsized positive impact on societies, it's something that is worth putting capital into. You're the friendliest of audiences. I really appreciate that. And so that's what we're doing at Luminate. And I know I'm short on time, so I'll tell you very briefly. We are a philanthropy that is part of the Omidyar Group. We're focused on making sure that people and institutions can work together to build just and fair societies. We do that by investing in for-profit and non-profit organizations that are doing work in a number of areas. One of them is media. Many of our partners are here today. You've heard from many of them. And we've done that by investing $314 million in 236 organizations around the world, of which about 50 million of those have gone to media. And we're committed to ensuring that more funding comes to media. Yes. And we're doing that focused on 4 different kinds of things: high-impact investigative journalism, financial models that allow for editorial independence, supporting press freedom and the right to question, and battling mis and disinformation online. And so, as I know you're going to club me out, but I spent some time praising you, so you gotta let me finish. I promise you, this is my last slides. So as Janine was saying, money is important, but it's not sufficient. So we're also building ecosystems. That's what we're doing with Velocidad. But the reason that we're funding Velocidad, and with this point I will end, is because, and I know this is true for Latin America, but I also know this is true all around the world, and is that as we're seeing democracy be threatened like never before, unlike any other time in a generation, we will continue to put capital, resourcing, and tools into supporting courageous journalists that are the front lines of transforming media, redefining it, and protecting the foundations of democracy. And that is a bet worth making. Thank you very much.
The IWMF will tell you about the meeting that we had, so important here on Thursday. Please, Nadine.
Well, I also want to start by saying thank you to Rosenthal, because this is the first time that the IWMF has been on the main stage at ISOJ, although we have done a lot of work in the past with you. And I'm here to talk a little bit about the workshop that we held on online violence against female journalists on Thursday. But first, I just want to give a shout, because that's not the only reason we're here. We also came here to launch our Gwen Ifill mentorship program, and we have about 20 journalists who are with us in the room as both mentors, leaders, and mentees in that program. So if y'all just want to give a quick little shout so people know who you are. Woo! So meet them if you haven't met them already. So at the IWMF, we focus on advancing women in the news media around the globe. And we believe that true press freedom can only really exist with the equal contribution of women's voices and stories. But there are a lot of forces at work that are trying to shut up journalists, and specifically there are forces at work that are also trying to shut up women journalists, both online and offline. And we know that online attacks on women and journalists of color silence their voices and silence their stories. So I just want to give a few statistics from a study that we did last year with Trollbusters, which is our partner organization. It was a U.S. study to look at the impact that online harassment is having on female journalists and their reporting. So we surveyed 600 women, mostly based in the U.S., and what we found is that 2/3 of those who took the survey had experienced some kind of online harassment. I wanted to do a quick show of hands. Could those of you in the room who've been harassed online as part of your work raise your hands, please? All right, look around. There's a lot of hands in the room. I'm not sure if it's 2/3, but it's probably close. And of those who did experience online harassment, 40% avoided reporting certain stories as a result of being harassed. That means stories are getting silenced. Those attacks are often gendered, and they're designed to shame women. Comments about their appearance, about their intellectual rigor, and about their professional credentials are meant to undermine them. And there's a lot of impact. This is why we're here, to talk about the impact that that has. That impact can look a lot like PTSD. It's really severe. It is a real big problem. But despite that, a lot of women aren't reporting it to their media managers or their supervisors. And in fact, only 4 in 10 of the women who took our survey did report it. So we wanted to know why that was. And they told us 1/3 of them actually cited that they were scared of being retaliated against, being taken off their beat, or losing future work because they reported it. And more than half of them said that they didn't think the management would do anything about it. That's a problem. The long-term impact is clear. It's about retention. 30% of our survey takers said that they thought about leaving journalism as a result of online attacks. We've been talking throughout this conference about the importance of newsrooms reflecting communities, about hearing from voices that reflect the diversity of our society. And when we're losing women and people of color out of the pipeline because of online harassment, that's a threat to press freedom and to our democracy. On Thursday, with the Knight Foundation and with ISOJ, we organized a day-long workshop focused on building resilience and supporting women who are facing this issue. We had 75 people there. It was really fantastic. Some of them are still here today. We heard case studies from Brazil, from Colombia, and from the United States, and we brought in more than 6 leading digital security experts to propose solutions. A few of them are here today still. I think we've still got Luisa Ortiz, Harlow Holmes, Jason Reich, and Jorge Luis Sierra in the room if you're looking for some amazing experts. One of the big takeaways that came out of Thursday's session was that newsrooms really need to adopt holistic policies that address both online and offline threats to their reporters, because the lines between those two things are blurring, and they often cross over. We know that digital attacks need to be taken seriously. Many newsrooms, however, don't have those policies or protocols in place. And my appeal to you today, if you're a media manager in this room, is to help us change that. If you work in a newsroom, if you're a media manager, can you raise your hand if you do have any policy in place that involves online harassment in your newsroom today? I see a few hands. I see very few hands. I'm not here to shame you about that. I'm here to ask you to do something about it. So we heard from Jason Reich, who's formerly at BuzzFeed, and he's now at the New York Times. He's a leading voice on building resilient media organizations that are prepared to deal with these digital threats to their reporters. And if you're in management and you're wondering how you can apply this, I hope that you will find Jason. I hope he's here somewhere today, and ask for his advice. But some of the things he told us were developing social media policies that separate the reporter's private presence from their public and professional presence as a way to protect them. Developing a threat assessment process inside the newsroom to be able to evaluate the severity of the threats that are being received. And also building peer support networks, because we know that this problem isn't going away anytime soon. We want to be able to help journalists, and particularly women and journalists of color, find the support so that they don't drop out of this industry. So I encourage all of the leaders in this room to create a culture where your reporters feel safe, and they feel safe to report those kinds of attacks to you. For journalists who are experiencing online harassment and attacks, we know it can feel overwhelming, and you may not know where to turn if it happens. But there are a lot of organizations working on this. It's not just the IWMF. We're working to build a global ecosystem of support to address online attacks, and we're working with organizations like CPJ. They have great resources on digital security. You should also check out PEN America's Online Harassment Field Manual, if you have not already, and the Frontline Defenders Security in a Box to start. We also provide emergency assistance to journalists who are under threat and in crisis. So if you're in crisis, we ask that you would reach out to us. And we can connect you with some of the great digital security experts that we work with to help you respond. The final thing that I'll say is that platforms aren't going to save us from this problem, but they certainly have a big role to play in helping us solve it. So please help us in holding them accountable. Thank you. Have a good day.
Now I'm going to call Andrew Gibson, who is a front-end engineer at Texas Tribune, our beloved Texas Tribune. He's going to talk about the hackathon that we just had. Andrew.
Clicker? Is there a clicker somewhere? Oh, I can just move through up here. Thanks. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Excellent, yes. I'm Andrew Gibson. I am a front-end engineer at the Texas Tribune, and I'm going to share with you a few highlights from our pre-ISOJ hackathon on the topic of building news credibility tools. First of all, any hackathon participants in the house? I think I saw a few. Yep, there we go. They're scattered throughout here. Excellent. First of all, thank you all for participating. So what do we exactly mean by news credibility tools? Well, we actually made this topic kind of intentionally vague because we really wanted to see the creativity of our participants. But in general, it meant the following things. It meant we wanted to see projects that addressed the idea of making it easier to identify reliable news content, making the news gathering process more transparent, and making it easier to fact-check news content. So overall, we had really great turnout at the event. This is just a kind of a small snippet of the people who were there, but we ended up having 6 teams in the 5 to 7 range. Interdisciplinary, we combined journalists and developers and designers and data people. Started the morning with some project pitches around 9 a.m., and then teams had pretty much all day to work until about 5 p.m. when they presented their ideas, their projects, and the judges picked the winner. So we had the cliche hackathon exorbitant amounts of coffee, which were consumed at a voracious rate throughout the day. And we had lots of great brainstorming with sticky notes and poster board and Sharpies galore. And I have to say that by the time 5 p.m. rolled around, we had 6 very impressive projects, and I'm going to give you a brief rundown of those right now. So we had MetaFact Media, which was an extension of an existing website. That website is Health News Fact Checking. And this team actually aimed to kind of extend that project and make it more accessible to reporters in their day-to-day work. We also had Wildfire, which was a browser or Chrome extension that, let's say you're looking at a tweet with a news article linked in it. What it does is actually give you an idea of whether that article is reliable. Very cool. We had NewsBet, which was kind of a quiz take on the theme. And what this does is readers are presented with a series of snippets from news articles, and it's up to them to decide whether the claim in that snippet is reliable or not, and they're given a score at the end. It's a very cool project. We had News Integrity Grade, what this does is take a look at the links in news articles, and then look at the things that those links link to, and so on and so forth, and based on that, kind of create an integrity grade for a news article. And lastly, we had our winners, which were NutriNews. So if you think about the nutrition facts label that you find on your food, well, what this team did is actually create a label, a nutrition label for news articles based on its contents, who shared it, who wrote it, and basically tells you, is this a healthy article? Very cool. We also had News Trust Box, which was a way, a snippet of code was the end result, which you can drop in a news article. And when you open it up, it has kind of behind-the-scenes information about how the article was created, including source documents and actually audio snippets of the reporters saying, yeah, this is kind of how this article was made. This is how we went about reporting it. Another great project. We had a wonderful panel of judges as well, which I was very grateful for. We had representatives from our 2 sponsors, Walmart Technology and Microsoft News, also KUT, and Robert Quigley, who may be in the audience somewhere here, from the UT Austin Journalism School. And they were asked to score the projects on these 4 categories: relevance, creativity, difficulty, and sustainability. Sustainability, in my opinion, being perhaps the most important, meaning could this project live on post-hackathon, kind of in the real news world. So again, here's a look at our winners. Not the best photo, but this was the nutrition label for news team. They walked away with 6 Microsoft Surface Go tablets. I think they were all very excited about that. And just to kind of wrap up here, a few takeaways from the event. I just want to say how impressed I was with the projects that were created. Many hackathons are 2 or 3 day events. This one was 1 day, basically from just 9 to 5. And the work that was accomplished in that amount of time was really, really impressive. I also want to point out that the multidisciplinary teams seemed to excel. The people who really embraced bringing together journalists and designers and developers. So I thought that was very cool. Also, journalists are a very, very valuable asset in hackathons. Certainly this one because it was news themed, but they're great communicators. They help keep their teams on task. Very, very important. And lastly, I just want to say that planning hackathons is hard, and for that I want to say I'm so grateful for everybody from UT and the ISOJ team who helped us plan this event. We really got a lot out of it, and we hope it can become a tradition before ISOJ going forward. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much. Amy's next. Amy is next, yes. Our own Amy Schmidt-Weiss, the Super Amy, will talk about her field of spatial journalism.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today I want to talk to you specifically about local news through a different lens. We've heard a lot about local news over the past 2 days, and I wanted to dive a little deeper into this. This is Jim, actually. I'm going to tell you a quick story about 2 people. This is Jim. He just moved to a new city. He's actually trying to figure out all the things happening in his particular city, but specifically he wants to dive deep into his neighborhood. He wants to know what's going on in the neighborhood. He wants to know what are the events happening that he can participate in, the good restaurants, the places that aren't so good. But he also wants to dive deep into what are some of the main issues happening in his community. But where does he go to get this information? He might have to go to a multitude of sites versus trying to find one quality source. We also have Kathy. She's just in the playground, and she is actually with her kids. She's been there for a while, so she decides to go home after a half an hour. So she's in the playground. As she's walking home, she gets a text message from her friend saying, "Did you see what happened?" And she said, "No, I had no idea." And her friend said, "There was an active shooter just 2 blocks away from you 10 minutes ago. Are you okay?" She's completely shocked. She wishes she would have known what had happened. But she had no source to tell her that information. She wishes that someone would have provided her with a news alert, notification to tell her in the space and place where she was in that moment what happened and what she could do to protect herself and her children. What do both Jim and Kathy have in common? It's looking at the idea of connections and how much connections make a difference in terms of connecting the public to the news and the community. Those connections help to strengthen journalism and to strengthen that relationship between the public and the news. Connections is an important part to this. And one lens that I've been spending a lot of time on in the past 10 years is looking at how much these connections can be seen through a different lens of location and how much place and space and location can be a more prominent player in the journalism process and practice. Now, this is not something that's in the future. It's actually happening now. We can see this happening specifically in 2 examples, but there's multitudes that we can see that are developing by the month. One is the Philadelphia Inquirer and LendFest Local Lab that launched the Here app last fall, where they've been actually geolocating news events in the Philadelphia area for people to walk around and explore spaces and places where they're in to get those news pieces of information. In Brooklyn, BK Reader has been doing this for over 1.5 years now, almost 2 years, and working with Bloom in terms of providing location-based news through their mobile as well as website for specific neighborhoods throughout the Brooklyn area. And again, with this, location is at the center of the journalism practice. It doesn't treat it as a second-class citizen or something that's just the where in a story. It puts it up front and center. Pew came out with this statistic last month that I thought was quite shocking. It said 47% of US adults say the local news they get mostly covers an area other than where they live, such as a nearby city. This is a problem for local news. But on the other hand, it's also an opportunity. We can see this as an opportunity to not only qualitatively, but quantitatively jump deeper into our communities. It means looking at exactly what defines that community. How do they see themselves? What does neighborhood mean to them? What does the word community or neighborhood actually represent? And exactly where are the spaces and places and locations that mean the most to them? And how could that be a bigger part of the news process? It was brought up this morning about data and how data can be gathered and accumulated through AI technologies and the power of data. Every single newsroom has a multitude of location data just waiting to be harnessed. And that location data can provide valuable information in doing a location audit of your news coverage. This is just a small sample of a map that I actually did this past year that broke down the news coverage specifically in Brooklyn for a small period of time, to actually look at exactly what areas of the community are getting more coverage than others. Yes, it does show gaps, but at the same time, it shows opportunities as well. And recognizing that certain neighborhoods, certain places, certain locations aren't getting the necessary attention or coverage that they should. And how much the community's voice can be heard by looking at this from a different perspective of location in particular. So I just want to leave you with one final thought. Digging deeper into what matters in your communities through location might help drive and inspire local news and help journalism thrive in your community. Thank you.
Amy, thank you. Now I'm going to call Sally. Sally Mar-Colon is the Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Digital News of our friends from Univision. So she's going to talk about from how to move from horizontal video to vertical video in a TV network.
Thank you so much, Rosenthal. I'll try to do this as fast as I can. My boom, 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 like you said on the email. Buenas tardes. Thank you so much, everybody. Like Rosenthal said, I'm Sally Colon. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Univision News. And I'm going to tell you a little bit of what we're doing. We love signal here. And try to tell you why are we on digital trying to move from horizontal, where is it? To vertical. And the main idea is for news shows to be easier to consume. If we do a quick show of hands, how many of you consume on your mobile device? Of course, that's easy. And how many of you scroll, swipe, click WhatsApp message like this when you're walking or somewhere else? Right. And so does 94% of the people that consume on a phone. They do it vertically. So why are we forcing them to change their phone to horizontal? And not even that. The younger ones, the ones that we actually want to reach that are coming behind, they have their phones locked to vertical. So imagine that, exactly, she has it, right? So that's when I heard that from my nephew, I was like, but what, really, seriously? He's like, no, why am I going to be changing my phone? So why do we want to do it? Why do they do it? When you do a video call, you do it like this. It feels personal. It feels close to you. So as journalists, we want to be close to you too. We want to take you with us to where we're going to do that story. And right now we're doing 2 shows in vertical. We're doing Real America with Jorge Ramos on Facebook Watch. I invite you to watch it. And we're also doing an analysis and interview show on vertical with Patricia Janiot, which is called Janiot PM. And the acceptance of the audience has been huge because they feel they're there with them, and the consumption is way easier. And actually this week, an American journalist, anchor Chuck Todd, tried to make the case to stay horizontal, and Jorge Ramos has a message for him. There you go. Oh, we have audio?
Vertical orientation. Videos are supposed to be horizontal, people.
I may be a little old school. However, I'm not afraid of shaking things up. Chuck, that's how you do vertical video.
Boom. Boom. So, oh, no, there you go. So how do we do it? So for Real America with Jorge Ramos, we do it with a camera crew, yes, but we also do it with Jorge's cell phone. Jorge is also one of the camera guys of the show. He shoots his interviews, he shoots B-roll, and when we have an interviewee that we can't get to, or they can't come to us, Jorge does the interview on FaceTime, on Facebook Messenger video, on WhatsApp video, whatever it is that we have at hand. And with Patricia Yaniot's show, we actually use a television control room to produce it and do the show, but then we use a third platform that cuts the video vertical and allows us to do vertical live streams on YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, everything else, and then we upload it to IGTV as well. Quick recommendation, if you want, would like more people to explore doing video in vertical because of that closeness that it takes you with the audience. Some quick tips: if you're going to use your phone, do adjust it to your settings to 4K. That's the maximum quality that you can get on your phone when doing video. And that's a really quick, if you have an iPhone, you just go to your settings, camera, record video, and you do it in 4K. And you're going to get the maximum quality for that video because we're all doing great journalism, great stories. Now we have to follow the audiences in what format can we reach them better that they want to consume. Also, think of the logos, social media comments, and text that are on all the platforms. Facebook and Instagram have like logos all over the place. Think of that. If you're shooting with a camera, we think of the screen in 1/3. So your subject always has to be in 1/3 of that screen. So have fun, and let's see more vertical videos. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are supposed to start the next session now. So the two next sections are absolutely amazing, grand finale, whatever. So get us 5-minute coffee break and come back here. Go to the restroom and come back here very fast because we're going to start in 10 minutes, okay? 10 minutes, 3:25. For us to start, I think it's a very, very strong grand finale of ISOJ, and we're going to start with which historically has been the most popular panel at ISOJ, which we call the Global Roundup. So this time is a panel on journalism in the age of authoritarians, populist, and polarization. So Katie Kingsbury from the New York Times will do us a favor and an honor of moderate this panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here and coming back so quickly from break. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go in depth with introductions to our panel, which is called Journalism in the Age of Authoritarianism, Populace and Polarization. I did want to note, however, that one of our panelists, Nigel Magamu, has not joining us today. On April 4th, his newsroom was attacked in Zimbabwe by the municipal police and the National Police Force. That caused him to miss his visa appointment, and so he was unable to get a visa to attend. But we are with him in spirit, and I want to kick things off with Cynthia.
Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for being here and for listening to our stories. My name is Cynthia, and I work in Confidencial Digital. This is one of the few independent media outlets that used to be in Nicaragua. And when people ask us about Nicaragua and we're outside our country, we try to promote it as a very beautiful country that it is. So we have beautiful beaches, and we have very impressive nature, and the people are so welcoming. And for journalists to try to convince them to come to our country, we usually say that the beer is cheap, so you're more than welcome to come. So when this dictatorship is all over, you can all come and have a party with us, because we're going to be free at some point. So this is a picture of when a very complicated day for us, a very sad day, which is when our building was confiscated back in December 14th. So the building, it happened in two phases. The first day, the police got in the building and they took all of our equipment and TV material and our accounting information. And so can you imagine going to your office that you left the day before, and you get there and it's like your house has been robbed, right? It was very sad. And we left thinking, there's no way that they're gonna come and do something to our building a day after this happened, but we were very wrong. So the police just occupied the building, and since December 14, we haven't been able to enter our second home. And this is my boss, Carlos Fernando Chamorro, and he gave an interview that day to Lucia Pineda, who's now in jail for exercising her right to the profession of journalism. And he said that the government can, steal everything from us, and they cannot prevent us from doing our work because our passion is not in the computer, and the computer doesn't make the articles and the investigation itself. It's us. So as long as we're thriving to do our job, there's going to be journalism for a very long time. So how did we get to this point? How Daniel Ortega, our president and dictator, took us to this point. So very quickly, he got to be president in the 80s with the support mainly of Cuba and the socialist bloc. And then after, a civil war and up to 50,000 people dead, obviously Nicaraguans didn't want to have any more war. So Violeta Barrios de Chamorro became president, and she's the first and the only so far female president of Nicaragua, and we're very proud of that. So during the 90s, she was the president of Nicaragua, and Ortega had this phrase that I'm not sure if I'm translating correctly, but it says that he was going to govern from down below, and that's what he did for 16 years. Until in 2007, there were elections, and he won the elections again. And since 2007 to this point, he's been the president, and he has changed the constitution so that he can run indefinitely. So during this time, as journalists, we have faced, this dynamic in which we don't have access to public information, and the president doesn't give interviews, and there's a politic of fear in which the people who work for the state, they don't want to give information because they're afraid of losing their jobs. And in the second poorest country of Latin America, losing your job and not having an income is something very important to people, and so they don't want to risk that. So what we're facing now, we're facing repression. This picture here is from the day after our building was confiscated, and my colleagues and other journalists from Nicaragua were covering this day in which everybody went to the police to ask information about this confiscation, and the police was after my colleagues, attacking them for asking what happened, right? Also, we're facing illegal imprisonment. Lucia Pineda and Miguel Mora used to have a channel called 100% Noticias, and they became really important during this political crisis because they were the ones who were broadcasting what happened 24/7, and people were always tuned, getting information from them. So they became what we called a pain in the ass for the government. So they're in prison, and they have been in jail for over 100 days now. So we try to, when we participate in these conferences, we try to get the attention on them, because if I'm not mistaken, they're the only journalists who are in jail right now because because they're doing their work, which is going there, putting a camera or a recording machine and asking questions. And that shouldn't be a crime, but in Nicaragua, it is a crime. So, I mean, for the government. And also, we're facing exile. Me and a lot of my colleagues have left the country. And Luis Galeano is here among us, and he fled the country after the building of 100% Noticias was confiscated, and more than 60 journalists have left their countries because they're afraid that they're going to be put in prison, like Lucia and Miguel, and because they're afraid of, losing their lives. And also, we're also facing like the blockage of the material that we need to print the information that we use to inform people. And La Prensa, which is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, media outlets in Nicaragua, they don't have paper to print. And I believe they won't be able to keep printing the newspaper after April or May. So they're trying to get attention from the public to say, if you as a citizen don't get the information from us, you need to get involved because media comes with democracy and we don't have that right now. But among this crisis, we have also, in Confidencial, we have gotten out of our comfort zone. And so we have applied certain changes to our model. Before we used to be in an office not 24/7, but almost. And so, and now we had to protect ourselves and protect our colleagues. We have been working remotely, and we're mixing, this use of offices that nobody knows where we are because of our own safety and the safety of the sources. And we have to keep things secret because we're afraid that that the police is going to come after us. And within this crisis, we used to broadcast 2 TV shows, one on Wednesday and one on Sunday on national TV, and we got off the air. So we had to, put everything on YouTube, and so we're adapting to this new model in which people are, following our live broadcasting for our shows. And before, we had this traditional commercial model in which we depended on advertising, but now we have done donation campaigns and we're selling ebooks and we're doing everything we can to earn the money that we need to support our company. And so, we're trying to adapt as fast as we can to, assure that we do the journalism that Nicaragua needs. Also, among this crisis, there's a proliferation of independent media outlets that are quite smaller than the traditional, traditional ones. So I think that we have become stronger because not only these media outlets have surged, but also the people have, felt so empowered by the fact that they're there and they're witness of this political crisis, and they can grab a phone and record everything. So in a way, we're not alone, and we're joined by the people who have believed in us, and they believe that the information has to be, out there so that people know the truth about what's happening in Nicaragua. So we hope to continue doing that and get stronger as time passes. Thank you very much.
Hi, I am Susan Comrie. I am an investigative journalist with the Amabungane Centre for Investigative Journalism in Johannesburg, South Africa. So, like most investigative stories, mine starts somewhere thoroughly nondescript, on the rooftop parking lot of a shopping mall in Johannesburg. But it was here in May 2017 when I knew that the country was going to change forever. And the reason that I knew that, the reason that my editor and the editor of another publication, Daily Maverick, had called me to this rooftop and told me not to bring my phone, my laptop, was this. Now, this hard drive, and I will say it's not the actual hard drive, it's a hard drive. It didn't contain state secrets. It had nothing like the Snowden files. What it contained was around 300,000 emails of a senior manager at a local IT company. And to understand why that was such a threat to the government in South Africa, I need to tell you a little bit about what's been happening in South Africa for the past 10 years. So we've been going through a period of what we call state capture. And if you're not familiar with the term, I guarantee you're familiar with the phenomenon. State capture effectively is the repurposing of the state for private interests. And it goes way beyond normal garden variety corruption. What we're talking about is private individuals, private companies being allowed to dictate who becomes the minister, what legislation is made, what contracts are awarded, and sitting behind the scenes as gatekeepers, scraping billions of rands in bribes of the whole enterprise. So in 2009, Jacob Zuma, he's a populist leader of the African National Congress, he came to power. Now he'd come into power facing corruption allegations relating to a 60 billion rand arms deal. And although the charges had been withdrawn on the eve of the elections, he still had to spend the next 9 years of his presidency with these allegations hanging over him. And so his reaction was to become increasingly authoritarian. The way that he did that, the first sort of point of attack, was to start shutting down any institutions that had investigative capacity in South Africa. So the National Prosecuting Authority, our equivalent perhaps of the Justice Department, the police's elite investigations unit, the Hawks, our equivalent of the FBI. Even the South African Revenue Services, our taxman, all of them were brought under his control. Credible people were removed and Zuma acolytes were put in place. Now the next way that they started to target journalists was through very repressive legislation. One of the worst pieces was the Secrecy Bill, which was passed by Parliament but never signed into law, luckily. And that would have given 25-year jail terms to anyone who published classified information. And then the final way that we saw, one of the many ways that we saw the media being targeted during this period was that we saw allies of Zuma's setting up their own media organizations and governments starting to redirect advertising budgets and also just redirecting their attention and their willingness to do interviews towards those newspapers and TV stations. So how did we react as the media? Firstly, we published. This was Zuma's homestead. It was enriched with 246 million rands worth of taxpayer-funded renovations. But when the media found out about it, the government tried to use a piece of apartheid-era legislation to prevent us from publishing the photographs. As you can see, the media thoroughly defied that, and no one actually got arrested in the end. The second thing that we did is we built coalitions and we mobilized. So, for instance, when the Secrecy Bill was being discussed in Parliament, we had coalitions built with trade unions, coalitions with civil society, with just about anyone who was willing to help us to highlight these issues. And the pressure did eventually work. Another very important thing, I think, is to say that, the media, as much as we're rivals, we also realize that we're all in the same boat together in this type of situation. And the media started sticking together. But one of the other things is that we also failed. One of the largest newspapers in the country ran a long series of stories about a rogue unit within SARS, the tax authority. They later retracted the stories, but by the time they had retracted it, the elite investigations unit and its investigations into all of these prominent political figures had simply disappeared. But one of the important things that we did, I think, is that we invested in investigative journalism. which is where we come in. So this is the team that I'm part of, Amabungane. It's a Zulu word. It means dung beetles. And you'll see our spirit animal is the African dung beetle. Our motto is digging dung, fertilizing democracy. And by 2017, we had done a lot of digging into these guys, the Gupta brothers in South Africa, Atul, Ajay, and Rajesh Gupta. Now, we had found them and their companies everywhere, in arms deals. We'd found them in the state power utility, in the state rail contracts. We'd found them in farming. We'd found them in IT contracts. But they were always lurking just behind the scenes. I mean, that great expression of governing from under, that was effectively what they were doing. Which brings me back to this. What this gave us, it was from one of the IT managers at one of their, what was the senior sort of executive in their IT firm. And although it didn't give us every part of the empire, it gave us an incredible amount of information about how the Guptas had captured the state. So this would eventually become the Gupta Leaks. It was a collaborative investigation between a number of different media houses in South Africa. And it didn't just allow us to, this was another, these are all the different journalists. Eventually, there's a long story behind it, but effectively what ended up happening is that you had just about every media house in the country working on the same trove of information and publishing daily. And it became a really positive collaborative space for the media, because even if you got scoop today, there was still more to publish. But the important thing is that it didn't just allow us to hold politicians to account. There were a number of multinational companies that were implicated in the Gupta leaks, as well as in various other leaks that came out at the same time. And what it really allowed us to do was to hold them accountable for practices that they had sometimes been using in other countries with impunity. Now, obviously, this was not going to, it didn't go down well with a lot of people. There was one of the things that hung in the balance, one of the deals that Zuma never managed to get signed was a 1 trillion rand nuclear deal with Russia, which would have built 9 nuclear power stations across South Africa and would have thoroughly bankrupted the country if he'd got it right. So it was kind of inevitable that we would face some pushback. It's sort of one of the strange things in South Africa that, it's in the sort of Venn diagram of the far right in America and the far left in South Africa, you've got George Soros sitting in the middle. They both think that George Soros is sort of behind everything. The phrase that got weaponized was white monopoly capital in South Africa. And it tapped into something which is very real in South Africa. I mean, it's a reality of South Africa that black South Africans still overwhelmingly carry the burden of unemployment, of crime, and of poverty in South Africa. And so it was tapping into something very real, racial fault lines in South Africa. But instead of being used to have a conversation about structural inequality, this phrase was kind of weaponized and thrown at the media to say, anytime we reported about the Guptas, to say, oh, we're anti-transformation. But in the end, despite all the noise, Zuma couldn't eventually stand up to the pressure. So on Valentine's Day last year, in a sort of 11 p.m. news conference, he resigned. So where are we now? We have a new president, Cyril Ramaphosa. He has instituted a number of commissions of inquiry into allegations of state capture. This is one of the most important ones, the Zondo Commission. And the really gratifying thing for us is that witness after witness that comes to the commission says, I only knew about this because the media reported it. Now we're also going into elections on the 8th of May. And just like everywhere else in the world, we've seen a rise of populism in South Africa amongst political parties. Now, one of the most popular leaders, Julius Malema, has really kind of perfected the kind of Trumpian dog whistle to mobilize and weaponize a Twitter army against journalists. These are some of the tweets that were sent to journalists who were reporting on corruption allegations implicating some of his party members. Another thing that we've seen, bots, trolls, influencers, all of it coming out in our social media. One of the interesting things that we're still trying to dig into, not all of it is being used just to simply attack journalists. What we're also seeing is there's a fight at the moment around South Africa's energy future, whether we're going to go renewable energy or whether we're going to look back at coal and at nuclear. And we're starting to see those fights playing out in quite a weaponized way on social media. And then just the last thing, one of my colleagues that I worked with on the Gupta leaks, he recently published this book about one of the most senior members in the ANC. Now, this guy Ace Magashule, he'd been part of Zuma's government, and he is still in place, along with a lot of other people who had participated and been implicated in state capture. He's still there. The reaction, though, when the book came out, there were protests at the book launch, calling him an agent, effectively. The Youth League of the governing party had decided to hold a book launch of their own, although it would have been a book burning. I'm glad to say that the book burning has been temporarily shelved. But yeah, that's where we are in South Africa. It's a complicated space.
Hello, everyone. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you for this wonderful opportunity. Thank wonderful Rosenthal. I still remember when I met him 22 years ago, we're getting old, at a cafe. And I had the privilege of being a transfer student at UT Austin, also 22 years ago. Well, as you might have heard, we have a new president since October, and he's a huge fan of your president. It's his main idol. And just like your president, he loves the press. Okay. I'm a reporter and columnist at Folha de São Paulo. Folha de São Paulo is the leading newspaper in Brazil. It's the largest one in circulation. It has 300,000 subscribers. Its website in October had 64 million unique visitors in October. Hold on, I have these numbers. Okay. Was founded in 1921, and it's the only. It has other companies related to it. Another newspaper, Datafolha is one of the main polling institutes. Transfolha is a transportation company, and also the largest internet portal. I have been working at Folha since 2011, and I usually don't do political coverage. I have been covering human rights and foreign policy for the last 20 years. So lately I've been concentrating on the migration issue. I spent time in Kenya, in Iraq, in Syria, several other places, also with the Venezuelan refugees in Brazil, covering this. However, I had covered the 2014 elections in India and the 2016 elections here. So I had been following the issue of the use of social media to manipulate the public opinion. So that's how I started investigating about the widespread use of WhatsApp, fake news, and bots during the Brazilian electoral campaign. Last year, Folha did the major scoops about Bolsonaro. The main scoops were all by Folha. One of them was about an employee. he had that was supposedly working in his office in Brasilia, but was actually working for his private home at the beach. That was done by Camila Matoso and Ranier Bragon. The other one was about his wealth and on the wealth of his family. He has 3 children, all politicians, and their wealth was not compatible with their paychecks. There was another one about his ex-wife who left the country, taking their child because accusing Bolsonaro of threatening her. And then the last one was about how businessmen were paying for massive bulk messaging by WhatsApp against the rival party, PT, the Workers' Party. After all these stories, we had, every time we did publish a story that was critical to the government, there was a swift reaction. But after the last stories that were followed by several stories about the use of social media, Bolsonaro had a very, let's say, interesting reaction. I have a short video here to show you.
Sem mentiras, sem fake news, sem Folha de São Paulo. Nós ganharemos essa guerra. Queremos a imprensa livre, mas com responsabilidade. A Folha de São Paulo é o maior fake news do Brasil. Vocês não terão mais verba publicitária do governo. Imprensa livre, parabéns. Imprensa vendida, meus pêsames.
Right. He said that over the phone to thousands and thousands of people at Avenida Paulista in São Paulo at one of his last rallies. So thousands of people were listening to this and some of them repeating it. You know, the end of Folha de São Paulo and everything. After he became president, we all thought that that was all in the past because it was campaign rhetoric and he would tone down now that he had won. But this was one of the first interviews he gave to the news show that is the most widely viewed in Brazil at TV Globo.
Presidente, o senhor sempre se declara enfaticamente, aliás, um defensor da liberdade de imprensa. Mas em alguns momentos da campanha o senhor chegou a desejar que um jornal deixasse de existir. É indiscutível que a imprensa não é imune a erros e nem a críticas. E isso vale para qualquer órgão da imprensa profissional. Mas também é fato que a imprensa livre é um pilar da democracia. Como presidente eleito, o senhor vai continuar defendendo a liberdade da imprensa e a liberdade do cidadão de escolher o que ele quiser ler, o que ele quiser ver e ouvir?
Totalmente favorável à liberdade de imprensa. Temos a questão da propaganda oficial do governo, que é uma outra coisa. Mas aproveito o momento para que nós realmente venhamos fazer justiça aqui no Brasil. Tem uma senhora de nome Valderice, minha funcionária, que trabalhava na Vila Histórica de Mambucaba e tinha uma lojinha de açaí. O jornal Folha de São Paulo foi lá, nesse dia 10 de janeiro, e fez uma matéria e a rotulou de forma injusta como fantasma. É uma senhora, mulher, e negra e pobre. Só que nesse dia 10 de janeiro, segundo o boletim administrativo da Câmara, de 19 de dezembro, ela estava de férias. Então, ações como essa, por parte de uma imprensa, que mesmo te mostrando a injustiça que cometeu com uma senhora ao não voltar atrás, logicamente que eu não posso considerar essa imprensa digna. Não quero que ela acabe, mas, no que depender de mim, na propaganda oficial do governo, imprensa que se comportar dessa maneira, mentindo descaradamente, não terá apoio do governo federal.
Então o senhor não quer que este jornal acabe. O senhor está deixando isso claro agora.
Por si só, esse jornal se acabou, não tem prestígio mais nenhum. Quase todas as fake news que se voltaram contra mim partiram da Folha de São Paulo. Inclusive, a última matéria, onde eu teria contratado, né, empresas fora do Brasil via empresários aqui para espalhar mentiras sobre o PT. Uma grande mentira, mais um fake news do jornal Folha de São Paulo, lamentavelmente.
Presidente, me permita, como editor-chefe do Jornal Nacional, eu tenho um testemunho a fazer. Às vezes, eu mesmo achei que
Okay, sorry. It's a bit long, but just a few fact-checking actions here. The employee, the reporters, they went there twice in different months. So unless she has 2 months of vacation every year, that doesn't sound right. The second story, no one ever said that foreigners were paying. It were like Brazilians, Brazilian businessmen. And the other thing is, according to Brazilian law, you have to allocate government advertising following technical criteria, at least in theory. So that would be illegal to threaten to withdraw all the advertising, government advertising. It's not working. Oops. Well, gonna keep on talking. Okay, so this was unprecedented in several manners. I mean, never a president had gone on the main news show of the country to say that a newspaper would cease to exist and still, attack a newspaper. And the other thing is the solidarity that the newspaper received. After that, we had all like a voluntary campaign online of people saying, I'm going to subscribe for Folha because I value democracy. So we got several subscriptions. After this, and after his inauguration, that has become the new normal. First was Folha, now it's TV Globo and Globo newspaper, and also Estado de São Paulo. Whenever there's a critical, some reporting that is critical that he doesn't like, he attacks directly on Twitter, and he also has digital militias. It's like armies of trolls and bots that threaten and persecute journalists and opposition leaders. For instance, there was a colleague of Estado that she was victim of fake news, and the president himself retweeted the fake news. I myself was attacked and threatened several times, both online and offline. The president is suing us to disclose all sources to all the stories about the bots, the WhatsApp, and everything. The newspaper, the philosophy of the newspaper is that we're going to keep on doing what we know, professional journalism, independent journalism, and we do not oppose the government. We're not opposition to the government. We're going to do as we did with other governments. For instance, it was Folha that had the scoops about Mensalão, which was the scheme of bribing congressmen to get favorable votes, and also about Lula's ranch. So we're going to still be doing this, and that's the direction we're getting. Keep on doing your work, independent reporting, and don't get intimidated. And that's what we're trying to do. Thank you.
Hi, can you listen to me? Well, I'm going to talk about the day the Venezuelan government crossed a new line and attacks against journalists took on a new dimension in Venezuela. But first, I want to show you 2 videos. In the first one, you're going to see a journalist recommending the population what to do in case there's no connectivity and there's a media blackout. In the second one, which was edited by the government, you're going to see this journalist. It's trying to make him seem like he's promoting a media blackout and a political unrest.
¿Qué pasa con los blackouts? La primera lección de la primavera árabe es que cuando son aplicados desde el poder ya es tarde. Es decir, cuando los aplican ya tienes a la gente en otra lógica. Lo segundo es que el efecto inmediato es que la gente sale a la calle. Eso pasa siempre. En el momento en el que tú rompes el tejido, la capacidad que tiene la gente de estar en común con otro, sale a la calle a reconstruir ese tejido. Entonces puede ser peor para ellos. Y lo tercero es que también buena parte de la infraestructura gubernamental depende de esas mismas redes. Y no tienen manera de hacerlo selectivo, de hacerlo discrecional. O sea, bueno, solamente bloqueo pero no me veo afectado yo. La cochinada que han hecho durante los días de protesta es que, por ejemplo, bloquean YouTube, o bloquean Instagram, o bloquean Twitter. ¿Qué hay que hacer en el caso de que de verdad no tengas nada? Salir a la calle a registrar. Es el momento en el que debes tener las memorias limpias, libres y demás, porque te va a tocar grabar videos, hacer fotos, entrevistar gente y ver qué está pasando hasta que vuelva la luz, hasta que vuelva la posibilidad de conectarnos. ¿Qué pasa con la...?
Okay, so this was the edited video. It has the music, actually.
¿Cómo creen que se ejecute este blackout? ¿Cuánto tiempo estiman que nos dejen incomunicados? ¿Qué nos recomiendan hacer? ¿Cómo creen que debemos informarnos durante ese momento? ¿Qué pasa con los blackouts? La primera lección de la primavera árabe es que cuando son aplicados desde el poder ya es tarde. Es decir, cuando los aplicas ya tienes a la gente en otra lógica. Lo segundo es que el efecto inmediato es que la gente sale a la calle. Eso pasa siempre. ¿Qué hay que hacer en el caso de que de verdad no tengas nada? Salir a la calle a registrar. Es el momento en el que debes tener las memorias limpias, libres y demás, porque te va a tocar grabar videos, hacer fotos, entrevistar gente y ver qué está pasando hasta que vuelva la luz, hasta que vuelva la luz, hasta que vuelva la luz, hasta que vuelva la luz.
And here they just quote Marco Rubio. So this is Luis Carlos Diaz. He's a really prominent Venezuelan journalist. He works with social media. He's a social media expert. And he was detained on March 11 from this year. He was riding his bike to go home while intelligence forces detained him and disappeared him for about 8.5 hours. Nobody knew where he was. Later, he was found and he was taken to state prison. Sounds pretty bad, right? Well, that's not all. All of this happened while the Office of the High Commissioner for the Human Rights of the United Nations was visiting Venezuela. Yes, there were human rights defenders in our country when this happened. So this is something that has been happening a lot in the country, especially since 2019. Here we have some numbers from Instituto Prensa y Sociedad. It's a Venezuelan NGO that registers these types of cases of violations to freedom of expression in Venezuela. So we had, in 2018, there were 266 cases of violations to this right. Only from January to mid-March from 2019, they counted 155 cases. What this NGO found is that this gotten worse while the Office of the High Commissioner of the Human Rights Representative were in the country. So that was like no protections for Venezuelan journalists. It increased their risk. So even though Michelle Bachelet's representatives were in Venezuela, Mr. Maduro lashed against media. So during the first 18 days of March, the NGO registered 50 aggressions against journalists in our country. This only has gotten worse in 2019 with the political crisis. Here are some examples of, international news correspondents that came to cover the political crisis in Venezuela. This is a Polish journalist. He was detained and brutally assaulted by police forces. Cody Weddle, he's an American journalist that got deported. And finally, Jorge Ramos from Univision Anchor, he was interviewing Nicolas Maduro in the presidential palace. And his media equipment were confiscated. But this is something us Venezuelan journalists have been dealing with for a long time. This is Armando Info Team. They are an investigative journalism outlet. And they had to abandon the country after they were being sued because of an investigation on corruption. So what it's like to be a journalist in Venezuela, it can be really troublesome, especially if there's a blackout and there's no running water to take a shower. So this is a Venezuelan hospital, all in the shadows because of a blackout.
I cover the health editorial area, so that means I have to go to hospitals and report on patients and the lack of access to treatment. I have talked to people that have to cross the border to look for chemotherapy because in my country there's none. I have spoke to a mother who has lost their 2 baby twins of starvation. I have spoke to patients who have lost a loved one because there was no blood to make a transfusion. And also patients that has been waiting for over 6 months to get a surgery. Oh, sorry. So I even have to tell security guards at hospital, I'm going to donate blood so they can let me access the healthcare center. This got really difficult. And these authoritarian traits and features from the government do not only affect us journalists, it also affects our sources. People are afraid to speak because they might get blackmailed. So if you talk openly about what's going on here, I'm not going to give you your treatment or you're going to get fired. This is something that has happened to doctors that have openly talked to us about what is going on. This situation gets really worse in a polarized environment like Venezuela's. So what's going on is that authoritarian governments have this script. They tell you, you're either with me or against me. Journalism is anti-power by nature. So we're not in favor of power. We actually criticize it. So automatically we're against. And even if you don't take a side, you're taking a side and you're choosing not to be with them. This picture is about the humanitarian aid that was supposed to enter with the opposition's help on February 23rd from this year. And what's going on right now, it's you can tell people the truth, but in a polarized environment, people are going to believe the truth that adjusts better to what they think or what their vision of reality is. So who burned the humanitarian aid? Maduro's government, a protester? In the end, people are going to believe what they want to believe and what adjusts better to their version of what's going on and their truths. So here's where journalists play a key role. And this polarization is not only seen, in the journalism we perform, but also in social media. This environment is nourished by bots, Twitter. Here's an example. This is a Twitter user that identifies himself as a Maduro supporter. So he's just saying, here's a list of journalists from Venezuela that should resign to their profession. And they just mentioned a bunch of journalists that are critical to the government. And here's a very specific demand. All of the journalists from Efecto Cocuyo, which is an independent news outlet I work for. And this narrative, this hate narrative and polarization narrative is nourished by the government. And I want to show you this video.
Lumeli Reyes, la campeona del arroz con pollo, la reina del arroz con pollo de los fake news. Usted no le gana a nadie. Cuando salgan más verdades, sin que la fábrica del gobierno, de fake news del gobierno, pueda actuar, ahora los mentirosos somos nosotros. Nosotros fuimos los que inventamos que estábamos reclutando niños. Muchos verán la masacre que se ha cometido con los venezolanos. Después no digan que no sabían de las violaciones de derechos humanos, torturas, tratos crueles y asesinatos. La reina del fake news.
Okay. So imagine the second most powerful man in your country had a TV show every Wednesday night that he uses to discredit and attack and put journalists on the spotlight. This is what you just saw. This is Diosdado Cabello, president of the Constituent Assembly of Venezuela. And he was talking about Luz Meli Reyes, my editor and founder of Efecto Cocuyo. He's telling her she is basically the queen of fake news, and she has been attacked several times on social media by actually telling the truth. And what you just saw is something that happens every Wednesday night. Diosdado Cabello has a board, and he puts there pictures and tweets from journalists and critical media outlets. And well, basically to undermine the confidence people have in journalists. So, I've talked to you about all of this, but I haven't talked about what is Efecto Cocuyo. My editors have been to ISOJ in previous years, but this is my first time, so I wanted to explain to those whose it's first time as well. Efecto Cocuyo somewhat translates to firefly effect. So basically, it represents a light by, yes, just one firefly represents a little light. But together, we are a bunch of tiny sparks that can illuminate an entire nation. So Efecto Cocuyo was born back in 2015 in the middle of a severe and critical moment for media, especially traditional media. The government was asphyxiating, and a lot of journalists migrated to digital platforms. So we're an independent news website that decided to tell the truth in such a critical moment for Venezuela. And we are committed to responsible journalism ever since. And right now, the other day, there was this reader who was telling us on Twitter, I never thought Efecto Cocuyo could be a metaphor of what is going on right now in Venezuela. And it actually is. It's a firefly effect. We are currently affected by a severe crisis of basic services. There are constant blackouts, constant outages. Actually, Luis Carlos Diaz, the journalist I presented you at the very beginning, he was accused by the government of Nicolas Maduro of participating in the blackout that left the country without electricity for 4 days. So we are committed to responsible journalism, and more than ever, we are gathering all this information to illuminate what's going on in Venezuela. Thank you.
Hey, hello everybody. I'm Blanka Zöldi from Hungary. And one thing you should know about us Hungarians is that we love to complain. But after these presentations, these amazing panelists, I feel that I shouldn't complain too much. Really. I mean, if you look at Hungary, we don't have any journalists killed. We don't have any journalists imprisoned. We are not getting threatened directly, and we don't have direct censorship. Still, in the past few years, we have seen that quite an interesting media landscape has been created in Hungary. This is diversity, Hungarian style. You wouldn't believe that these are 14 different local news websites. Just like last year, a couple of weeks before the Hungarian elections. So they published the very same interview with our Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, who was calling all the voters to vote for his party, Fidesz. And surprise, surprise, voters did vote for his party, and he secured another 2/3 majority. And if you have noticed this very happily smiling guy on the picture, he is a childhood friend of our Prime Minister who has, over the past years, magically become one of the richest people in Hungary. And by the way, he used to be the owner of these local websites. So you can imagine that it's becoming increasingly difficult to work as an independent journalist in Hungary. And I would like to show you 3 things that we do at my organizations to overcome these difficulties. Creating a community of readers, never getting lazy as journalists, and, well, making people care about what we write. So let's go back to the beginnings. Back in 2010, when Viktor Orbán came to power, he really quickly realized the importance of media to maintain his popularity. And first thing the government did was to change the media law. Then they kind of overtook the public media, and then came the crackdown on the private media as well, which means that many oligarchs close to the Hungarian government, the one that you see, so for example, earlier, bought up a lot of formerly independent news outlets.
Actually, my former workplace was one of the first targets of this crackdown on private media. It was called Origo. It was one of the most popular news websites at the time doing daily news. And it was an amazing place for a very long time to do objective journalism. It was owned by a huge telecommunication company, the Hungarian subsidiary of Germany's Deutsche Telekom. So everybody for a long time thought that, oh, okay, nobody will mess with such a big company. But as you can see, they were wrong. Around 2013, we started to receive strange requests from within our company's organization to drop certain stories, to postpone certain stories that were politically uncomfortable. And long story short, my editors didn't give in. My chief editor was forced out from his job, and many journalists, including myself, resigned from this newspaper, which, by the way, later turned out one of the main propaganda tools, like currently, of the Hungarian government. So, freshly unemployed journalists. We were thinking about how to go on, how to pursue independent journalism in the future. So we realized that if we want to do independent journalism, we want to have a completely independent organization. Independent from politicians, independent from owners, and also independent from advertising revenues. So in 2015, my former bosses, Pető András, Zsáling Gergő, and Weyer Balázs, founded Direct 36, an investigative journalism center based in Budapest, Hungary. Two things you should know about our newspaper is that we don't do daily news. We only concentrate on long-term investigations, corruption, abuse of power. And the second thing is that we don't have any owners. We rely on mainly on crowdfunding. So last year, for example, around 2/3 of our costs were financed by support from our readers. We don't have a paywall. That was a decision to make our investigations available for as many people as possible. But we do give a lot of extras to our supporters, depending on how much money they can give us. So for example, from 10 euros, $11, they would get exclusive newsletters ahead of the publication of our articles. From 20 euros, they would get an ebook. From 30 euros on, they would get invited to the different meetings that we organize. For example, roundtable discussions, movie screening, and so on and so forth. And these events give us the possibility to make our organization more transparent. For example, we talk about how we do our reporting process, what challenges we face. We also hold workshops for our supporters where we tell them about the techniques that we use, for example, to conduct our investigations. So me personally, most of the times, I do courses about how to dig out information about people on social media. They just love it. But we also use these opportunities as an opportunity to get feedback from our readers. So we actually do ask them, hey, what do you think about our work? What stories should we cover? And by the way, do you have any tips for those stories? And fourth, we also ask them, do you have any kind of special knowledge that you could share with us? So for example, we have been helped by our supporters to scrape databases, to translate like Russian contracts, whatever you can imagine. So it's basically a win-win situation because our supporters feel involved and our reporting is more powerful. So this is how we could actually deal with the ownership problem. We are not part of the big pro-government media landscape. And there are a couple of independent news outlets still in Hungary which are also not part of this media landscape. But you can imagine what happens to this type of media. I mean, it's not so difficult to find out. It's fake news. So we don't get answers to our questions. You can see Orbán's response to one of the biggest news organizations in Hungary. And just a personal experience, like last time when I tried to register for Orbán's press conference, my access was denied because they said that too many people were interested in it. So yeah, but what can we do? I mean, we cannot just say that, okay, then we cannot get information, we cannot get answers. We need to work even harder to get these. So for example, when I was investigating how the Orban family was involved secretly in EU finance projects, I knew that I really had to confront him with my findings. But I also knew that it's practically impossible to do that in Hungary. So when I saw that he had a press conference in Brussels, an international press conference where he normally answers journalists, I just took a flight, flew to Brussels, and I confronted him there, my own prime minister in another country. He was pretty surprised by this. And yeah, we also don't receive a lot of answers to like public information requests. This is a problem, but when I started to investigate exactly this type of projects, I just submitted requests to like local governments that, hey, could I just look to all the documentation of the project that you have? And they were like, okay, weird girl, like have fun with those boxes. And then I did have my fun, because in a couple of hours, I found a proof, a documented proof of the family's involvement in these types of projects. So this is another thing, that we really want to get our facts right, supported by documents, so we cannot be attacked. By the way, ever since that occasion, I was not let like anywhere close to this type of documents, but we do have, you know, freedom of information laws, so I can attack and sue government institutions at court, and this is what I've been doing like over the past couple of years. It's not so much fun, it's a lot of energy, but it helps us to write powerful stories. But what happens when we uncover powerful stories? I mean, you can imagine that Hungarians are pretty tired of hearing about corruption, especially when they don't see politicians being carried away in handcuffs. So what we are trying to do is making people care about these stories. And I have to say that we are just experimenting with this, like the several opportunities that we have, like getting out from our little bubbles. So this picture was taken like a couple of weeks ago. We just printed the first few paragraphs of our articles and went out to the street and handed it to people and started to talk to them, explain why it is important. And we also organized like road shows in different like countryside villages and towns in Hungary. And the other last thing I would like to highlight, the importance of international attention that we can receive in Hungary. We are part of several bigger journalism networks, such as the ISOJ, the OCCRP. So it gives our reporting a real power if we work together like other foreign journalists. And also it was a pretty cool feeling when, for example, the European Union's anti-fraud office started to investigate a project that we had reported on. Yes, and the last thing I want to say is that our reporting is available in English, so please check out our website, because I think it's really important to look at what's happening in Hungary. Orban is not only an example in Europe, he is also friends with all these amazing people like Trump, Bolsonaro, and we can learn a lot from each other's experience and also how to overcome the challenges. Thank you. Köszönöm.
You sit in this one. No, this is awesome.
Right. So I'm going to ask a few questions and then take questions from the audience, so please start thinking of them. I like to always remind people that the definition of a question is a statement that ends with a question mark. So I wanted to start, one of the things that really struck me was how similar your stories were in a lot of ways. I mean, we heard things like fake news, we heard things about bots, we heard a lot about intimidation. We also heard a lot about collaboration. And one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about, and you've probably heard a lot about at this conference, is this question of it's a tension in a lot of newsrooms in the United States since Trump was elected, this question of, are we the resistance? Are we the opposition? And it really depends on who you ask, both in newsrooms and outside of newsrooms. And I'm curious to know what you guys think about that. And so I was hoping to start, we could have each of you just talk a little bit about what your thinking is and how you see yourselves. And Blanca, I'm going to ask you first because you use the word independent and objective often, which is something you hear often in the United States as well.
Yeah, this is very important to us because so many times when I call up people saying that, hey, I'm Blanca Zöldi from Direct 36, they're like, oh, this is the opposition, right? And it's like, no. I mean, we are actually writing stories both about the government, both about opposition, if it comes to like wrongdoings that we uncover within the opposition parties. So I think the most important thing is to be fair with everybody. I mean, we never received a criticism from the government because we didn't contact them, for example, for comments. And I think what we can do, you know, to actually counter this type of like being labeled as like opposition activists and paid by Soros and these kind of things, that we are being fair to everyone.
Cynthia, I wanted to ask you, I mean, your interaction with the government is so much more visceral than perhaps anyone else on the stage, the fact they've seized your office. Do you see yourself as part of the opposition to the government?
No, we, as journalists, we stick to the facts. Our job is to investigate and to talk to people about what's happening. And I guess in Nicaragua, there is some confusion because people, sometimes they don't know the difference between perhaps opinion and reporting. And they think that we're just against the current government, which is not, I mean, it's not the case that we say we're going to throw, you know, Ortega out because we hate him. No, we investigate and we discover that he's corrupt as other governments that have been in Nicaragua. So we just cover the news, and that's our job, so.
And Patricia, I mean, you're also dealing with a somewhat more recent example of this kind of intimidation. You know, how do you think of this question? You know, have you guys changed at all the way that you're dealing with the government from before?
Well, I think it wasn't for me.
No, Patricia.
Sorry.
It's okay, but
it's okay. No problem. People should jump in too. We should have a discussion. Yeah.
Not really, in the sense that we just discover the facts, but all the media has been very vocal about calling him what he is. He's a dictator. So perhaps that's not what he likes to be hearing. I think we're more outspoken about it, and everybody is. So they think that we're just making a campaign against him, and it's like, that's what you are, man.
I think the whole objective of this intimidation attempts, and mainly by the bots and trolls, right, which is very massive, be it on Twitter, on Facebook, is to keep us from doing our jobs. So I thought, for instance, it's interesting, President Bolsonaro visited your president like 20 days ago, and then the vice president came. And the newspaper decided, instead of taking me out of the coverage, they said, no, you're going. So I did cover both. And the vice president gave me an interview. And the moment he gave me an interview, you had this evangelical deputy saying, you can't talk to the communist reporter. You can't talk to the communist media. And they're going to keep on doing this. But we have to keep on going there. We're not opposition. We're going to do what we did in all the other administrations. Just go there and do your job.
And Susan, can you talk a little bit more about how you've come together with other news outlets and collaborated and tried to expose the information that you have?
Sure, yeah. I mean, look, to a degree, the collaboration with the Gupta leaks was sort of forced on us by circumstances. But it became a really powerful thing for us because we eventually had, we're a small newsroom. We only have probably about 5 or 6 reporters altogether. But we eventually had sort of 19 reporters all working together and kind of dividing up what we needed to work on. And that was just within our formal collaboration. And then outside of that, you still had journalists from other newspapers. To a degree, because of the period that we've gone through, it's built a natural collaboration between journalists, even from rival media houses. Although we're entirely, independent, donor-funded unit, and we work with everyone, everyone kind of understands they were in the same boat when we were sort of, during the state capture period. So I think everyone's come out of that period with a huge amount of that collaborative spirit kind of extends. But I think on the question of being treated as the opposition, of course that's also what we get told. You're just the sort of official mouthpiece of the opposition parties. One of the interesting things for us is that we now have some of our municipalities being governed by coalition governments of opposition parties. And the old expression of power corrupts, that's led to kind of new forms, new trends in corruption coming out of those places. We still get told that we're backing one political party or the other, but I think to a degree that allows us to sort of push back and say, look, we're reporting on everyone, we're going after everyone. It doesn't stop us from being criticized though.
I don't know if everyone caught it, but one of the things that Juliet said in her talk was that she often operates without water and clean water to bathe and electricity. In this moment of what is actually a really acute crisis in Venezuela, I'm curious to actually ask you about, Maduro's opposition. Like, do you see that as hope for a more free and independent media, or is that more of the same? Can you talk a little bit about how news organizations have been dealing with that question?
Well, regarding, the opposition question, it is difficult because if you're going to approach a governmental institution, the first question they're going to ask is, oh, but you're with the opposition or are you with Maduro? You're with the right or you're with the left? And in fact, they actually go in the computer or their cell phones and log in www.efectococuyo.com to check on the latest you've reported. And based on that, they decide if they want to talk to you or not. But what I see right now, we're in a heavily polarized society, and to Maduro supporters, we're kind of like terrorists, but to some opposition supporters, like the most radical ones, we're Maduro supporters in disguise. So we stand in the middle trying to tell the facts, to tell the truth, to tell what's going on. And either way, it's really difficult because it's heavily, heavily polarized.
All right, let's take some questions from the audience.
One of the striking issues that we're seeing is these digital militias. I think in Mexico we found that at least 15% of what happened last year was forms of trolls, paid people to incite hate. And my question is, in that context, they also incite radicalization of opinion and becomes that you are the enemy of the people by facto to real people that hate you. What can you think you can do as journalists to be against these things?
I can jump in with one very quick thing. One thing that we found that shuts trolls down quite quickly, we've started publishing an evidence docket with our stories. So we try to put as much of the evidence into the evidence folder as possible. And I think, shutting down the trolls by just saying, here is a link to our evidence docket. Please go and take a look. If you disagree with anything, come back to us and let us know. That's one thing that it doesn't always work. Sometimes the trolls will just carry on. But
I agree. Yeah, I agree. We had a story that the Museum of Natural History might cancel this ceremony for Bolsonaro, right? So then we tweeted it, and then you had several readers saying, oh, you're fake news, you're Folha, you hate Bolsonaro, and then you just put their official Twitter, American Natural History Museum, and you don't say anything. Because otherwise if you engage, so just put the proof out there.
I agree with that. You cannot fall into the government's narrative or that hate speech. That has happened to us a lot. I remember last year in the same program, TV show I showed you, the government was saying that we were 180 workers in Efecto Cocuyo. We were going on a strike because we didn't get paid enough. We are 20 journalists, but we're not going to discuss with them on that. We just let the facts speak and our work speak for ourselves.
All right, let's take another question.
There's one there. Someone catch this?
Oh.
Sí, casi.
Very good job.
I think we talk a lot about in Latin America about journalists being a little bit trapped in a polarizing environment, but I wanted you guys to maybe reflect a little bit on how have we as journalists contributed to that polarizing of society itself, because we sometimes oversimplify through our own narrative. So in Colombia, it happened either you were for peace or against it. We've seen it in Venezuela also. So what have you seen of, what can we do better in that sense?
Great question. Okay, you want to answer that?
Yes, absolutely. We see that in Hungary a lot, that depending on what type of news you read, you basically live in like two different worlds. That's true. And also I have to say that the more like left liberal media, which is normally against the pro-government media, has also contributed to this kind of like language actually to discredit like politicians, and the too much opinion in the articles really contributed to this kind of polarization. What I see we can do as like personally as journalists in our own articles, we always look for the different sides of the stories, what I've mentioned earlier, to actually know you just cannot go and say that I'm not going to contact the subjects of my investigations before the publications of the article. So always like presenting as much as possible like all of the sides that are appearing in your articles.
Can I just add something? We heard yesterday from a conservative journalist that liberals don't think they have a bias the same way as fish don't think they're wet. So I think the first thing is that we have to admit everybody has a bias. So before we write, we should examine what and why we're writing it.
I think also that there's a huge problem in Latin American societies, and it is that there's no media literacy. And I think if we promoted that, perhaps at school and universities, and to talk about more how the media industry works and how it is to be a journalist and investigate, then I think people would understand more how the dynamic of the profession is. And also to be closer to the audiences, because maybe in the past the journalist was like in this podium, and then the rest of the people were just, below, and they were seen as very powerful people. And now with technology, we get to talk to people more. So perhaps we should just get off the podium and have this debate or conversations with people in which we explain.
I think we have another question up towards the top.
Yeah, hello. I heard from a few of you that some of your audience have made comments about like what exactly journalists do, and I'm glad that the conversation has turned to news literacy. What are some of the strategies, if there are any, that your news are trying to do in order to educate your readers of what journalists actually do?
Yeah, I can get this question because we do that a lot. I mean, we have like annual crowdfunding campaigns. We don't want to overburden our supporters, but we, for example, like pay a lot of attention to actually explain how we work, which we think is a good way to pursue independent journalism. So we actually like created videos explaining that, for example, after writing a draft, then it goes through like, the hands of 1 billion people, including lawyers, and then we actually showed them how our articles look after being fact-checked. Like, the 3-page article with all the footnotes turns out to be like a 10-page article. So, just to make them understand what steps are needed to have a balanced reporting.
Yeah, I think this, we recently launched a crowdfunding campaign for the first time, and we had like a group of people that wanted to talk to our director. And it was the first time that our director talked like, it was because of security reasons we had to do it on Skype, obviously. But because we used to do these meetings in universities in which we talked about confidentiality, etc. But this was the first time that we actually talked about the political situation, and people asked us how we're operating and how we were working and how we were overcoming the difficulties of working in a dictatorship. So I guess that when you realize that you have to talk to people like in a closer way, then you broaden the scope of understanding of the audiences, and that may work.
In Efecto Cocuyo, we also have crowdfunding campaigns, but I think one of our main flagship programs is that we have something called Efecto Cocuyo Summer School. So we go to universities, especially like outside the capital from Venezuela, and cities where normally these types of events are not held because of mostly monetary problems. So we go there and we go to universities, and we do not only talk to college students, but also to people that are currently journalists and that want to become better and improve their work. So we try to teach them not only tools like digital tools on how to do media and videos and stuff, but also the ethics of journalism, and we approach different topics related, hot topics that are really, hot topics in Venezuela.
All right, we have another question up there.
Hi, I have a question about Brazil. So I work at The Intercept here in the US, but I know that my colleagues at The Intercept Brazil have also been aggressively reporting on the Bolsonaro government and have been personally attacked by him. And I'm wondering if you could speak kind of to the media ecosystem and how newsrooms, like traditional newsrooms like yours, interact with independent media, digital-only media, and just kind of how that looks.
Yes, actually, Leandro de Mori, the head, has been blocked by the president on Twitter. It's a big deal. I think we don't have the type of collaboration that some countries already have. Like you were saying, that there was an understanding among media outlets that, democracy is what is at stake here, so we should collaborate. I'm not sure if we're seeing this yet, which is unfortunate. But I think we're going to get there because that's the situation, It's regardless of you being, more left-leaning or more, everybody's going to be pro-free press, pro-democracy. So I guess that should lead to more collaboration, which does not exist yet, I think.
That seems like a really great note to end on. I want to thank our amazing panel. Please let's give them a round of applause.
I told you that this international global roundup is always very popular, very powerful. We learned so much. Now we're going to move to another country that has some problems also. The next panel is covering an online president, White House Press Corps in the age of Twitter. This was an idea of my dear friend Evan Smith, who helped to put together this panel and who is going to lead the panel. And I would call Evan and you can put the chairs. We're gonna have a conversation with Evan and the four correspondents. They're bringing the chair. I want to tell you, if a housekeeping little thing, if you don't mind, if you can get your bottles or whatever things you have instead of leaving it behind, that will be helpful, because afterwards I'm going to pick up all of the bottles. I will recycle, but you can recycle on your own. So thank you very much. I think we're ready for you guys. Evan. Oh, one missing mic. But you can give a sort of an intro and entertain and,
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Say a few things. Don't repeat that speech from yesterday.
All right. So Rosenthal is asking me to fill the time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce the program that we have today and introduce our panelists, and then they'll come out, we'll sit down, we'll get started. We're going to talk for a while. We'll take your questions. This will be the grand finale of this great conference. Once again, give Rosenthal a big hand for what he put together here. So I am Evan Smith. I am pleased to welcome our 4 distinguished guests to Austin, folks I really like and especially admire. Excellent journalists, all carefully chosen and perfectly suited to answer the question that is the premise of this session's title. What is it like to cover the first truly online president? In our lifetimes, journalism has surely changed and politics has surely changed. The art and science of being a political reporter has surely changed. And the both sides of the ball aspect of being a political figure covered by the press, the offense and the defense, has surely changed. God knows the White House and its relationship with the press has surely changed. Whether merely for now or forever remains to be seen. Sitting squarely at the center of the confluence of these changes is Donald Trump, who always wants us to talk about him, and so we will. What does his utilizing, or some would say weaponizing, of the online space to conduct the serious business of the United States mean for the work we all do and for the public we all serve? That is our question today. So let me introduce our panelists. We'll have them come out all together and we'll sit. Yamiche Alcindor is the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour. She is also an NBC News and MSNBC contributor. She came to the NewsHour. Yeah, come on up. Have you sit right there? Good. She came to the NewsHour from the New York Times, where she was a national reporter writing about social issues and politics, particularly the intersection of race and politics. A native of Miami, she has an undergraduate degree from Georgetown University and a master's degree from New York University. Kimberly Atkins is a senior news correspondent for WBUR, Boston's NPR station, reporting on national political news from Washington, D.C. She, too, is an MSNBC contributor. Previously, she was Washington bureau chief of the Boston Herald. A native of Detroit, she's a graduate of Wayne State University, Boston University's School of Law, Boston University's School of Communications, and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Jonathan Lemire is White House reporter for the Associated Press and an NBC News and MSNBC political analyst. He's covered Donald Trump all the way back to June 2015 and the Trump Tower kickoff. He previously spent more than a decade as a reporter at the New York Daily News, covering the 2012 presidential campaign, City Hall, and the 9/11 attacks. He is a native of Lowell, Massachusetts, and a graduate of Columbia University. Finally, Eli Stokols, who is White House reporter for the Los Angeles Times and an MSNBC political analyst. He previously covered the Trump administration and the 2016 presidential election for the Wall Street Journal. He's also been a reporter at Politico. He's a native of Irvine, California, has an undergraduate degree from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's degree from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Please welcome our distinguished guests. Give them a big hand. Good. Thank you all for being here very much. So let's begin this unintentional meeting of the Columbia University Alumni Association. Yamiche and I are left out of this, sadly. By asking you all whether the job has turned out the way you expected. Substantively, what you cover, and practically how you cover it. Is it different, Eli, from how you thought it would be?
Well, this is the first time I've been a White House reporter, so I didn't cover the Obama administration, the Bush administration, like some of the colleagues who we work with at the White House.
But you covered him.
I have a suspicion that what we're doing with this administration is a little different than what our predecessors experienced in terms of the way the days play out and the sort of yes, it's different than any other White House before, but having covered the campaign, having followed Donald Trump, it's about what you expect in terms of the complete lack of process internally, the fact that you can try to report around and figure out what he's going to do. But at this point, maybe at the beginning, advisors would say, oh yeah, he's going to do this, he's getting out of the Paris Accords, and it would come true, or sometimes it wouldn't. We're at a point now where you talk to most people and they say, I think he's going to do this, but I don't really know. I mean, it is very much an imperial presidency now, much like his businesses were. Right. This is a guy who just has a very small circle around him, doesn't trust anybody, wants to be the focus, and that's how this administration runs. Yeah. And I think that, on election night 2016, when we realized he was going to win, I think most of us were surprised.
There's really no there's no playbook, Kim, right, for that. I mean, the fact is, Eli says imperial presidency. We also hear chaos presidency. And in some ways, this has been chaos journalism, has it not, for the last 2 years?
Yes, because the major way that it's different in my experience is you could sort of get into a rhythm covering other administrations from the White House on down. I mean, I've covered, from school boards all the way up, and each one, you sort of understand it. You get into a rhythm. You understand how things are going to play out. You could do things like plan your week. In a way that with this presidency, you absolutely cannot, because you don't know what's coming one day to the next. One of the fundamental differences about this administration covering it as a journalist that I found is that in the past, I realize now I could take for granted some certain things. Like I could take for granted that information that I got from the White House, unless there was some glaring reason to believe that it wasn't true, was true. I could do things like look at a transcript that was provided and not question it. In a way now, you see officials and you talk to officials who you know sometimes are telling you something that's not true. You know that it's not true. And you know that they know that you know that it's not true.
Right, yeah.
But they're still telling these things to you.
Yeah.
And you have to make completely different judgments as to how you use information. I mean, I won't take a transcript from any administration source without actually having seen the person say that, tape the person say that, or see a video of what exactly that person says.
You have to fact check the fact check.
You have to fact check everything, and you can't take anything for granted, which creates a lot more work and also really changes. I mean, I am currently, and for the last 2 jobs that I've had, have been a one-person Washington bureau, and I have to be very careful about how I allocate my time because I cover a lot of things. And I stopped going to White House briefings because I just found that it's an exercise in futility.
Well, I want to come back to the way that the White House, that's a good thing to bookmark, the concept of the White House briefing today and how that works. John, Kim describes the new normal, but really it's the new abnormal, right? There's nothing normal about it except for the fact that we've normalized this abnormal aspects of all of our jobs.
Right. And also, Kim, the cancellation of the White House press briefing.
Right. It solved the problem. Yeah.
Cease to exist, basically, right? Yeah.
But yeah, there's no question. We've never seen a president like this before. We've never seen an administration like this before. We've never seen Washington run like this before. This is exactly who Donald Trump has always been. There's a thought that the presidency would change Donald Trump. Instead, Donald Trump has changed the presidency, at least temporarily. This is how he ran his business. It's how he ran his campaign.
Right.
As you said, I was there from day one.
You were a tabloid reporter in an era when Donald Trump was a celebrity, a fixture of those people.
I covered him at times at the New York Daily News, just about Donald Trump, man in the news, so New York celebrity who weighs in on this or that. Donald Trump, Celebrity Apprentice and so on. Like that is stuff that we would care about to a degree. And he has not changed. He still cares about the same things. He cares about being in the news. He cares about generating headlines. He doesn't necessarily care if they're good or bad headlines. He just wants to be talked about. And we have had, as a news media, had to adjust to that. And we have had, and I think it has been a struggle at times to sort of recognize, like, how do we cover this? How do we accept that what he is saying, we cannot necessarily take it at face value?
Right.
Can we really fact check every word he says? One thing we get a lot is whether we've had, few of us have had Oval Office interviews with him, or we've had moments where we've encountered him in a pool spray, with a gaggle of reporters, or a chance to talk to the president, whether it's at home or on an international trip. It's like, well, why don't you, when he says something that's not true, readers will say, or people on Twitter will opine, like, why do you not stop him? But at the same time, you can't actually interrupt everything he says. He is still the president of the United States, and you have to have a balance between holding him accountable, but also, like, he is still the president. What he says, to some degree, even if it's not true, is still news and has to be covered, but it has to be covered in the correct way.
Yamiche, you are, of the 4 up here, the one who kind of came from the outside to the inside, right? You had been a campaign reporter. You covered the Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump campaigns in 2016. But you were not a White House reporter until you became the correspondent for the NewsHour in January of last year, right?
Yeah, and I spent most of my time covering Bernie Sanders in 2016. So I covered the tail end of the Trump campaign.
Right.
And for me, I remember when I started getting into political reporting, I had this thought where I said, okay, before I was covering breaking news and hurricanes and natural disasters, and like this, I'm going to a subject matter where there are schedules and people know where everyone's going to be, and there's kind of a way that people are going to cover politics, and that's kind of blown up. It's almost like covering a hurricane every day, because every single day you have no idea if the White House schedule is going to change. You have no idea if there's going to be an impromptu briefing or an impromptu moment where the president's going to say something. I think I would agree with pretty much everything that they said, which is that you have to not only fact check everything, but I also think that media organizations are deciding what's worth fact checking, because you can't fact check everything. And I think now we're realizing that you also can't fact check every tweet. Every tweet doesn't matter. I think in the first 6 months, news organizations were struggling to figure out how to cover the president's Twitter. I remember back in the day, I never covered President Obama, but we all made a big deal if it was signed B.O. Remember those days where we were like, oh, Obama really typed that one out. Like that seems hilarious now. Like, it's just, so, but I also think that as someone who wasn't covering politics, to me, I've written a couple stories about this. President Trump, for a lot of people in this country, feels like someone that they know, either your uncle or a teacher or someone that kind of feels like someone who likes reality TV, who eats fast food, who doesn't always tell the truth sometimes, but who is still kind of popular and charismatic, and people kind of like to listen to him. I think he's a reflection of America in a lot of ways, and I think that we're all learning a little bit more about America as we cover President Trump.
Is there a difference, Yamiche, between the way you covered or would have covered a person like the president for print versus television? So we have a TV reporter, principally. I mean, nobody is only one thing anymore. You're all on television, for instance. But we have a TV reporter, we have a radio reporter, we have a print reporter, and we have a wire service reporter. So we have 4 different types of reporters. I'm wondering, is there a difference in the way that you cover this president, say, for TV versus for print?
Well, this, as you mentioned, this is my only president I've covered ever, so I've only been covering it for TV, but I will say that, I mean, obviously TV has restrictions on time. So one of the biggest lessons that I learned was just this idea that you might have 1,200 words in print to write about all the different nuances and things that happened. I think of just, we'll talk about what happened this week, this idea of busing immigrant detainees into sanctuary cities.
Right.
There's a whole thing that you can do in print where you have context, where you can talk about the rallies, talk about maybe even interview families of immigrant detainees. And in TV, if you have a minute and a half or 2 minutes, you really are covering, the president said, well, the news broke, the White House said that night that this is floated and rejected. They said it again that morning. Then the president said, he tweeted, actually, that's not true. We're still looking at it. And then he says, actually, in the Oval Office, we're really looking at this. This might be a really great idea. So you have, like, I feel like there's a little bit less context for TV because you're just trying to move things along. But you also have to be more efficient. So I think I love TV in some ways because you do get to learn, if the best TV reporters give you some of that context and some of that nuance while also making it short and sweet.
So Yamiche is reporting for everybody because the news hour is for everybody, and the wire service, the Associated Press and other wires are also for everybody because your stuff's going to run all over the country. So you're writing for a national audience.
Right, and certainly the biggest difference between covering for TV or print for me is I wear a lot more makeup on TV.
And fake eyelashes, maybe?
Once in a while.
Are you revealing secrets that we don't know of the MSNBC green room? Is that the... Yeah.
But I think that the AP, you're right, is that we're writing about this president for the country and for the world. Right. So there is a degree of sometimes we have to do it in a slightly broader sense, or make sure we rely on those context paragraphs that, because we want to be, it's not necessarily like a Politico where you kind of can understand like who their audience is. And they're read everywhere too, and Politico's wonderful. But they certainly have a Beltway-centric viewpoint at times.
You are writing for a mass, maybe the most mass audience.
I think that's right. And what we also do is that because The Wire has always been what it is, we're more adept and well-adjusted to cover someone who makes news so immediately, the Twitter aspect of this. Since that's sort of what we've always been, is trying to move quickly and move fast and sometimes very brief if we need to. But even for us, the speed of this president, the way he careens from headline to headline, the way he changes the story so many times in a single, not just day, but hour.
Right.
It's not a news cycle anymore, it's a news minute. Right. A former advisor of his said that to me once that like he's concerned, he's not looking to win that news day, he's trying to just win that news, that moment, that interaction, because he's so certain he wants to change the chyron on the bottom.
And as you say, the wire service mentality or approach is perfect for that.
It is, but there are challenges too. I will say, one thing that we've come across is that, certainly we're moving, let's say it's an AP News alert, right? It's just 130 characters, whatever it might be. We're trying to just capture what he said. But sometimes what he says is not true. Or you say something, or he says something that requires that fact check. So that's been an adjustment for us too. We've had to learn on the fly that in that, we're trying to be fast, we're trying to get it out to the global audience as quickly as we can, but we can't just regurgitate like what he says, because that can be very misleading.
Now, Kim, your audience is in Boston, right. Blue America.
Yeah.
Eli, your audience is California, bluest America, right? So rather than these, Yamiche and John are thinking about the country, you all are primarily focused on your slice of it, and in particular, they're not Trump. It's not Trump country, Kim, right? That's it.
It is not. I mean, but it's also not. Massachusetts and New England isn't quite as homogenous as they get credit for. I mean, you have a lot of people, there have been changes there. For example, the Republicans they sent a Republican to the Senate not too long ago, and the Republicans who were challenging.
You just reelected a Republican governor.
Right, it was a Republican governor. You have a section of the South Shore of Massachusetts, for people who are familiar, is Trump country in a lot of ways. And the people who have challenged folks, Elizabeth Warren's challenger, who didn't really come close, but he was full on MAGA. So you have pockets of that throughout there. But you also have, one thing that is interesting working for a local publication, a local news organization. I keep saying publication because I came from newspapers. You think about how these things impact you. So one thing that this week, there is a town, Somerville, in Massachusetts, just north of Boston, which is a very vocal, open, self-described sanctuary city by the mayor. So when Donald Trump engages in this type of rhetoric, this type of policy, it has a direct, immediate effect. And you have people at the White House who will engage, locally with these folks, and you're really bringing those voices in. Or when different policies come up, a lot of things, we talked about healthcare, we talk about what Mitt Romney did in Massachusetts. So it's a way of sort of talking about the local impact of not what the policies and the rhetoric coming out of the White House, how that's working. That's my job in that. And then on the MSNBC side, it's a much broader, more analytical, with a view toward places like Massachusetts, but kind of put this all in context for folks who aren't within the Beltway, what this means.
And Eli, I like the analogy that the Somerville thing is great, because in the moment, your job is going to pivot off of exactly how what you cover affects where you are. I mean, you have sanctuary cities in California, Eli. The first line of this story about the president's plan was, we're going to dump all these undocumented folks in Nancy Pelosi's district up in San Francisco, right?
Right, and I think, for the LA Times, which is, happy to say, a sort of revived, growing organization now.
Paper on the way back up the mountain.
Yeah, we've added a lot of people and really trying to figure out what the paper is. And I think, it's in this spot between being a large regional paper and a small national paper, and trying to figure out which stories do we have to chase, where are resources best spent. It's not so much that when you cover Trump and you think, well, my audience is a bunch of California liberals, so I can really hit them hard here. Right. It is more thinking, okay, immigration is a story that really matters to our readership. So that's a place where we're going to go hard. And we've hired a person in our bureau in D.C. just to focus on immigration-related stuff, and the White House reporters work with her a lot. We also have an environmental reporter covering climate change. Right. So we work with them a lot. And you're really trying to figure out, when you're covering something that the presidency of Donald Trump is so overcovered. I mean, you turn on any cable network right now, you are going to hear Trump news. There's no room on cable news anymore for poop cruises or for, you remember that when the cruise ship was out at sea? That dominated CNN's coverage for, that doesn't break through now. Right. Donald Trump is ratings. And so you're competing. Everybody can write the same story about his tweets. And I think, as we pointed out, we do that less now. We've adjusted to that. Everybody can run fact checks and point out that what the president is saying is not true. And it's still important to do that because he is the president. He has the loudest megaphone in the world. And you have to point out when he says things that are not true. But you also have to look on this really competitive, over-covered beat. How do you add value? And that can be a challenge when you have a president who every day is throwing dozens of tennis balls for us to chase.
Well, you know, and Yamiche, John said correctly that it's not even every day any longer. It's every hour or it's every minute. We used to talk about the 24-hour news cycle as an innovation. Now it's like a 24-second news cycle, is it not? I mean, we're at a point where nothing gets any hang time on television, on the front page of papers, and these are stories that in another era would have been dominating the news for days. They happen and we push them aside 5 seconds later. That's got to change the calculation, doesn't it?
I think it changes the calculation, but I also think news organizations are getting better at finding ways to follow up on that. Like I'm thinking at some point, I'm going to read a really good story, possibly, I probably might not have the time to do it myself, but there's going to be some sort of good story about what would the resources mean to take, what would it take to actually bus these immigrants to sanctuary cities? Where would that money come from? What would that actually mean from a actual functional logistical point of view? I feel like there's ways for us to follow up on that, and I think that's the power of having multiple news organizations looking at the same thing. I think there's someone in the newsroom somewhere across the country saying we need to assign someone just to that story. So I think newsrooms are getting smarter about not just letting the president dominate what we end up talking about. I think we are about 3 or 4 years into almost every week being about the subject that President Trump wants to talk about. And that, I think, as news organizations, we're starting to think, okay, well, how do we back away from that? Remember, everybody remembers Infrastructure Week happened like 5 or 6 times. And journalists were like, it's not Infrastructure Week. Like, it's just not. And I think that
Always Infrastructure Week.
Right, it was always, and the infrastructure has still not happened, right? Like the infrastructure bill still hasn't happened. So I think that journalists are getting better at that.
Kim, has this change in the pace, the kind of Indiana Jones outrunning the boulder aspect of political journalism, is that about him or is that about it? In other words, if it were not for him, would this change be something we'd be talking about? Is this specific to him, or is this really about how journalism has changed, the news creation and the news consumption environment has changed?
Yeah, I think it's all of the above. I mean, it's certainly being driven by this president who has completely upended the way the presidency is covered. But I think it also very much reflects on the news industry as a whole and different news outlets. I mean, I came from a daily tabloid newspaper, which happened to have been, filed for bankruptcy and sold and lost like 70% of its staff. And I was the White House reporter, and, we have no budget, we had no anything.
You're a one-woman show.
I was a one-woman show in Washington, and so I would try to do some of these stories. Hey, I want to see how this policy might work or play out, and I would pitch that, and my editor would say, that's great, and then Trump would tweet, and he'd say, go cover that. And there was literally no bandwidth for a paper like us to compete, and we were one of, I was at the Boston Herald, there's the Boston Globe, which had a whole bureau.
Right.
It was really hard to compete in that way, and it's a lot better now that I am at an organization, an NPR affiliate, that has a budget, that has a full staff, that has editors that will give me time to flesh out a story and really get to beyond the daily tweets and really get to how this policy is going to impact people. And that's been a real big change, but not every news organization has that luxury. And I think what you're seeing is a lot of people just trying to stay ahead, trying to stay on top. But a lot of good journalism is happening right now. I mean, you guys, there are a lot of publications who are taking time, you see the stories out of the Times or the Post, and it's like, after talking to 32 administration officials over, about this, and really gives you a deeply reported portrait of what's happening inside this White House. So I think it depends.
You make a good point. Eli, Kim's making the point that the economic distress of the business trickles down to the bandwidth and the human resources available to chase some of the stuff that might get you off of the treadmill, right? The Times and the Post are great examples, but they're exceptions that prove the rule. Right, they're unusual cases. Maybe the LA Times will be another one of those cases very soon. As you say, you're hiring everybody that the Atlantic is not hiring at the moment, right?
It's probably a good place to be.
Right, but in the typical newsroom, the ability to do that is just not there.
Right, but you're also seeing, this moment, and I think television really plays into that because we're all on television several times a week, if not several times a day.
Right.
You see this sort of moment, and it's played on television, which is the medium that matters to the president. But you see on television, there's almost the celebration of reporters covering this White House, to the point where every story is played as if it's a huge Woodward and Bernstein scoop, and everything is Watergate, and you sort of lose this sense of proportionality. I think that's partly because this is aberrational in the entire American experience, and we're in this crazy cultural moment, and everything is shaken up, and so it's hard to sort of, in real time, make the right decisions as far as resources and coverage. But in terms of the economic incentives with the exception of where Yamiche works, we're all working to try to make money. We're all, you're working for public television, right. And a lot of days
for public radio.
Okay, you're right. So two of us.
Actually, he's non-profit also, buddy. I'm on a list. This is terrible.
This panel is not.
You were this close.
This is.
It still matters, though, how many people are watching. And
No, of course.
Sure.
If it's not a day that ends in Y, if I'm not getting corrected at least several times. But, my point is that on the whole, the economic incentives I've heard Jeff Zucker say, when we stopped covering Trump, people changed the channel.
Right.
And so I think that applies not just to television.
So in other words, he's right that he's the best thing that happened to the news in terms of
is right, and he
ratings
tells us
and
that,
clicks and everything.
And I think that's one of the things that is hard. You want to go off and do enterprise. You want to not follow every tennis ball that he throws out there. And yet, I've been in a situation where editors in the morning will say, "Oh, you don't need to cover that." And then throughout the day, it will, the tweet. And then throughout the day, it will kind of grow into something. And then it becomes a big story. And it's like, that's a story that editors want.
You end up back in the same place.
And they want my name on it. They don't want John's name on it, right? They're paying us to cover the White House, so they don't want to take a wire copy story. So then sometimes you get, taken off of your enterprise story. Your stories are great. I'm just saying. For my editors. But the point, so the point is sometimes, even if you have the right intentions, I think the economic model for a lot of these my paper and everybody who's not on this panel, but it's hard to sort of, step back and say, okay, I'm going to do this.
I think we could also say something that maybe like the president is still an interesting thing that's happening. I remember covering the Bernie Sanders campaign, and you're working, like everyone else on the campaign, it's 17, 18-hour days. I remember I used to dedicate 1 hour a day to TV because I like TV, and it relaxes me. And then I would probably get off the bus and get to this hotel and have a 5 a.m. call time. So it's midnight, and you're looking at literally 5 hours, maybe 4 hours. I'd flip on the channel, and there would be a Trump rally going on, and I'd find myself just staring at the television, and it's not my beat. This is not something that I'm covering. I'm literally taking this in as a viewer, and I'd just be like, wait, what's happening? What did he say? And to me, it's that's just, it's the nature of it. It's why it's interesting. So as much as people can say, the president's being covered too much, there's actually the fact that even when he was a candidate, he was interesting. And now that you see a president who has so much power, saying all sorts of things. I remember when they were floating, taking away birthright citizenship. These are important, super important topics that even if they're being delved off on Twitter, it's actually governance. He's governing on Twitter. So you can't ignore the tweets either, because when you change the transgender policy for military, and that's a tweet, it's a big deal for a lot of people.
It is like that Twitter feed, a statement from the president. I mean, this is actually, the fact that it comes from him matters. You talked about 17 hours on the stand. I wanted to ask each of you the time that you're working, because we know you from television maybe first. We see you sometimes first of the day on TV, and we see you sometimes last of the day on TV. This is a very different job than it would have been a generation ago in many respects, but in that respect, what would you say on average, kind of snap answer? How many hours a day are you working to do this job?
There are days where you're working starting at 6 a.m. for a TV show, but even if you're not, you're up and looking at Twitter. You're up and looking at Twitter.
You're up watching other people on that, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, these days can be 12, 14, 16, 18-hour days, but routinely.
Same.
Yeah, you never really shut it off. And the funny thing about President Trump is that you get the daily schedule, and it says, the president has his briefing at 10 a.m. or whatever, and he has a little thing at 2. But by now that he does most of his damage, or makes the most news, when things that are going to be the most noteworthy, when he's unsupervised. So that's early in the morning when he's watching TV, or late at night. So you just
Executive
kind of on all the time. You make plans to go out to dinner, and then you wind up looking at your phone like a jerk the whole time because that's when he decides
don't know. Kim, you made the point about the White House briefing, right? You made the meaningless. The fact is that the mechanics of covering this president are both less structured and weirdly more structured, because you know that any time, as Eli says, a bomb could go off, right? A journalism bomb could go off.
Right, and that affects everything else, right? I mean, I spend a good amount of time on Capitol Hill, too, and in response to all of this, you will then have members of Congress who are, doing things, and you're running around chasing them to get reaction or different things. So, yeah, every day you literally, in the morning, my routine is, generally speaking, in the morning, 7 or 8 o'clock, I'll email my editors and say, hey, this is what I'm working on today. And invariably, by noon, that has changed.
It's completely changed.
It's totally changed.
Right. John, you talked about the cancellation of the White House press briefing. That is abnormal compared to previous administrations, right? There was a little bit more standard way of operating in terms of the White House press corps. Is that a bad thing necessarily? Is access to the staff in that context overrated? Is anything coming out of those briefings?
I think that, the answer is we're always going to want more access to officials. So the answer is yes, we want the press briefing.
Do you have less access to officials because the staged theatrical White House press briefing is no longer?
Well, I think there are a couple of things at play here. First, yes, there are moments where the White House press briefing felt like it was being turned into a television show, where whether it was the press secretary behind the podium, or sometimes even some of the reporters in the seats, maybe more than sometimes. We're trying to sort of become part of the story, become part of the line, and that's not what those things are meant to do. But there are. The Trump administration is sort of notoriously slow for engaging with, if you have questions, and sometimes it can be very basic things like, what is this bill about, or what's the president doing tomorrow, things like that.
Noticeably slower than previous administrations.
No question, much, much slower. And, and part of that is born from the press, from people who work in the White House being sort of afraid to get out ahead of the president because they might get contradicted at any time. This was a great example this week, of course, with the Sanctuary City busing example, where they said to reporters, this is not under active consideration, and the very next day, the president overruled them. He says they were. Look, the White House Correspondents Association is a firm believer in these press briefings. We feel like there's a chance, it's not just for us, but for the American people to hear, their representative of government. They're paying for that building. They're paying for that podium. They should be able to get their questions answered in terms of, and it's not just, it doesn't necessarily mean about palace intrigue, but policy that impacts a lot of Americans, or international policy that affects the world. So yes, we would still like that to happen. There are, of course, other ways to interact with Trump officials. You get answers other ways, by other means. But I think the briefing, though flawed as they may be, something I think we'd still want to come back.
Yamiche, one of the criticisms when the briefings were happening on a more regular interval, because what's happened is there were sort of semi-regular briefings and then it sort of dropped off to the point where there were weeks and weeks with no briefing, is people said, okay, there's a briefing, so Sarah Sanders gets up at the podium, and then, some say, she simply lies, doesn't tell the truth, doesn't give facts that are usable in the context of traditional journalism. Maybe not having a briefing is actually better than having to do that.
I think I would echo what Jonathan said, which is that I and the White House Press Corps Association, White House Correspondents Association, believe that briefings matter, and that having a set time to sit down and have the American public hear the question, watch the administration engage with media is important. Because even if Sarah Sanders says something that's not true, you don't have to say, oh, well, there was a helicopter going by, so maybe she didn't really hear the question, or maybe, there was some confusion there because there were so many people jostling. I mean, we've gotten to the point now where most of the information that you see on TV from gaggles, as we call them, we've been saying gaggles, which is basically like a group of reporters questioning an official, is happening, maybe 30 feet from the briefing room. So we're talking to Sarah Sanders as she's walking back into her office, and we could literally just go into the briefing room and actually have a conversation. I think the key thing to remember is it's a lot harder to dodge a question if you, one, are sitting in an actual space where everyone has heard the question and everyone's waiting for your answer. Also, I think the idea that other journalists can follow up if Sarah Sanders doesn't say something is a lot easier to do in a briefing. So I think at first the White House press corps was getting, criticized, and criticized for not pushing Sarah Sanders on questions. And I think we started to see over the months and months and months that if Jonathan asked a question and it wasn't clearly answered, that Hallie Jackson would ask a question, then maybe I would ask it, then someone else would ask it. If it's an important question, then Sarah Sanders might say, oh, well, this is the third time I'm answering it, and maybe we'd finally get something that's a little bit clearer.
So there is something lost or something missing.
I think so.
In the disappearance for now or forever of this institution.
Yeah, just very quickly to follow up on that. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's the setting. It's these wild scrums in the driveway where Sarah or whatever official is. It's much easier for them to dodge follow-up questions as opposed to setting in a briefing room where we can go after it. Now, to be fair, President Trump does engage with reporters and takes more questions from reporters than his predecessors. He does.
Well, the fact is, for all the criticism, he is more available to you all on a kind of a catch-as-catch-can basis than President Obama was, right?
No, he is. He takes questions in the Oval Office. He takes questions every time he leaves the White House. He goes out to the South Lawn, and Marine One's in the background. As you said, the helicopter rotor is going, so it's sort of hard to hear. But that's part of it. He takes questions, but he takes them in settings often, not all the time, but often where he's able to kind of just not do the ones he doesn't want to. It's harder to sort of to pin him down on something because it's not in a controlled setting.
It also makes it more likely that you can get a question. I mean, like I said, I will sometimes go when he meets with some other head of state, and there will be some sort of press. Those are valuable to go to because you never know when he will take questions or some other sort of press availability. Where you've all seen it. At times it turns into this hour and a half long thing. He'll get up there, start having fun, and then you might actually get to ask a question. I think that's important to know. It's also important to note that other administrations have not exactly been press friendly. I mean, this isn't a situation where the White House has been really open and responsive to the press, and all of a sudden you have these people who are shutting down press briefings and telling reporters things that aren't true. I've never seen this level of lying. But it was really hard. I mean, I'm a little older than some of the folks up here. When I first went to Washington, it was the George W. Bush administration, and it was fairly easy to get questions answered. Like, I don't understand this legislation. Can you talk about this or this policy that's coming out? And somebody would talk to you and even if it was on background, you'd have something to get a better understanding, fill out that story. That dropped dramatically in the Obama administration, where they switched to doing things like blog posts and other things that made them look very open and transparent, but they actually weren't really talking to us that much.
You didn't actually see him very much.
Right, no, and you didn't see him. I mean, I asked Barack Obama questions up to the lead up to his actually getting into office, and I never got a question to him during the actual administration. It was not really easy. So it's changed, but it's always been a struggle and a challenge for the press.
Whereas, Eli, you cannot escape President Trump. The fact is, you see his face, you hear his voice, you cannot get your eyes off him because his face is never not in front of your eyes. It seems like every day, all day.
Well, I was the pooler, the person who was the print pooler a couple weeks ago, and it was the day when he had the head of NATO was visiting, and so they have a spray scheduled during a expanded meeting, and so you think, okay, we're going to go into the expanded meeting. Nope. As soon as the president is sitting in the Oval with the director of the president of NATO? Secretary
General of the UN, right.
Thank you. Secretary General of NATO is sitting in the Oval, and we've all seen this a million times. The president has some foreign leader sitting next to him. He brings the press into the Oval, and he just starts talking about the news of the day. He's holding a press conference. He's holding the other person hostage. In this case, they're talking a little bit, the NATO guy, about burden sharing, but that's so you think, okay, he just talked for 24 minutes. He talked about immigration. He talked about all the news of the day, the Mueller report, et cetera. Turn off your tape recorder 24 minutes. You go back out and you think, okay, well, the spray, we don't need to do the spray in the cabinet room because we just did Nope, we're doing that too. And it's repetitive, and it's the same thing. It's like he sees cameras and he wants the audience. And, I will agree with the other three reporters on this panel that we don't want to see the briefings go away. I would say that my feeling is that's generally more for the next administration than the current administration, because I think the current briefings in their form, maybe it's helpful for the country to see Sarah Sanders stand up there and not be able to answer the same question over and over again. And reporters now are very good at following up on one another's questions in the room so that becomes apparent over 15 minutes or however long the briefing is, that there are certain questions she can't answer. But on the whole, that is an opportunity for her really to condescend to the press, to perform for the audience of one that is the guy sitting in the Oval. And we don't really get a ton of information out of it. And I would just say, we all want access to officials, to the president.
Right.
We've all talked about, if you get the president in off the record or you get him in a gaggle, keep him talking, right? You hear every reporter says you got to keep the president talking. Well, that is not really that big of a challenge with this president. And I often sit there and he keeps talking, and you have to wonder at some point, yeah, he's accessible. Yes, he's doing several interactions with the press sometimes in a day, but you have to step back sometimes and ask yourself, what is it worth? He's flooding the zone with the same talking points, most of which are untrue. Right. And so you have to question what the access
but Jonathan's
clearer or less clear.
Jonathan's point about he can answer the questions he wants to answer and doesn't have to answer the questions, the great illustration of that the other day was he was sitting, maybe it was with the Secretary General of NATO, but he was sitting with somebody when Assange was dragged out of the embassy. And he was asked about WikiLeaks, and he said, I don't know anything about WikiLeaks. And there was not an opportunity really to get in there and say, but then somebody asked him about the Masters tournament and Tiger Woods, and he talked for 2 minutes uninterrupted about that. Right. That wasn't really an opportunity, Jonathan, to press him on the WikiLeaks Assange stuff, because it wasn't really a formal setting where you could get a second question in.
That's right.
You can ignore or pretend to hear not something that...
That's a case, obviously, where his evasiveness didn't prevent the stories all written that he, of course, said, I love WikiLeaks every night.
Everyone showed the same clip reel.
Right, in the final 6 weeks of the campaign.
Right.
But yes, that is harder. He's only held a few what we'd consider formal press conferences since he took office.
Right.
Now, he does do ones with foreign leaders, although those have really scaled back too in recent months, the 2 and 2s as they're known, where it's 2 American journalists and 2 foreign journalists, each you get a question of right. each head of state. He is really, he wants to flood the zone. He wants to be on TV. He wants to have his image and his voice, but he wants to do it in the settings that he prefers. And those are often these sort of informal ones. And again, to his credit, he's taking questions, but it allows him to sort of to dodge much more agilely than he would if we were in a formal setting. And these pool sprays are great examples where he will, Eli and I were both in the pool in Vietnam, in Hanoi, a month back or so when he had a summit with Kim Jong-un, and we asked questions, and he answered questions about the summit, but when a question was asked to him about Michael Cohen,
right.
Not only did he refuse to take it, he then tried to bar the press from coming into the next event.
Or Sarah did. We don't. I don't
Someone did. Tantamount.
Yes, the administration did.
Yamiche, I've heard a couple of people up here talk about lying, and no surprise, right? People have mentioned lies. Is it your job, in the context of your service as White House correspondent for the NewsHour, to fact check, to counter stuff that you believe or know not to be true? Do you consider that part of what you're there to do?
Yes.
Right. How would you grade yourself at doing it? Are you good at it? Are you able to do it?
I'm biased toward myself, obviously. I would say I'm doing a great job. I think the viewers of PBS hopefully think that we're doing a decent job, because I think that between myself, but also between our anchor Judy Woodruff and the people we bring on, guests, to try to maybe sometimes deconstruct things that he said that aren't true that are more complicated, to really explain to people. If he says something like climate change is a hoax made up by the Chinese, maybe instead of me just saying, actually, that's not true, China didn't make up climate change, what I should do is bring on a guest to explain what this report from the president's own agency says about climate change. But I think it's our service. I think as a reporter, our service is to explain to people what's true and what's not. And I think it's also to make the smart decisions on what we want to pick out. Because if the president says 10 things that aren't true, but we find that 2 of them are things that are going to really impact the lives of American people, and the other ones are that, I always think about the first controversy of this presidency, or at least the one that I think of as the first one, was when he was talking about the fact that his inauguration crowd's size was bigger than President Obama's. So we wrote about, everyone wrote about it and we talked about it, and he still basically says it sometimes if he's in a mood.
Yes, he does.
But is it really worth fact-checking that versus...
Every single time.
Yeah, is it really worth fact-checking that every single time? Or even more, even now, is it worth fact-checking at all when there are other things that he said about maybe about transgender, or about the impact of climate change, or about economics, or about other things that I think, at least in my own mind, have a bigger impact.
Kimberly, as a viewer, though, I have to tell you, it drives me crazy when I hear him say something over and over, just as an American. I hear him say something over and over that I know is not true. and to let it go uncorrected, there's just something that messes with my brain that no one will call bullshit on this. And the example that I always come to personally is when I hear him say, I won the votes of women in the 2016 election. He did not. He won the votes of white women in the 2016 election.
Correct.
And I hear this over and over and over, and he says it, and it often goes uncorrected. And I know that journalism, to Yamisha's point, there's only so much you can do and so many times you can do it. I must have heard him say it 50 times. What the hell are we supposed to do about that?
Sure. I mean, he says a lot of things like that, like how he's the greatest president for African Americans ever, and all these other things. He says he makes.
I suppose that's a subjective statement, although not really.
You're right. Look, I think it's true. I mean, if we spent all of our time correcting what he said, we wouldn't have any time for any other substantive journalism. I think that overall, journalists get a bad rap for not doing enough of it. I think we do a great deal of it. We were certainly doing a great deal of it before the election. And I think the election, a lot of people blame the media, saying that we didn't check this guy out enough or we didn't counter
Right,
what he
that
was
you
saying.
have
It
something
was just
to
like, I
answer
don't know
for.
what
That's right,
we were supposed to do, because we were really doing that along the entire way. I think the results of the election evidence something different. I don't think it was people didn't know who he was. I think he was doing more to show everyone who he was than we could possibly do. But I think it depends on the medium. I mean, I get frustrated, like you say, you get frustrated watching television. I get frustrated sometimes on Twitter when you see, and I understand that there's the limitation of 280 characters, but you will see Trump says blah, blah, blah in a tweet, and it goes out, and I'll, sometimes retweet and quote and say, which isn't true. I feel like people see that and think that the press is just mimicking, where most of the time, even in that tweet, when you click on the story and you look, they give context and they say what is incorrect about that statement. But it's really hard. It's hard with the 24-hour cable news cycle. It's really hard with Twitter. There's so much information, and there's so much counter information and bad information. I muted my mentions a long time ago on Twitter, but the amount of times that I get people responding to me or making comments on my story telling me that what I'm saying, what I reported factually, is not true is amazing. And I just think, how can people just deny the facts that they see in front of their faces? But they do. It's this flood of information and misinformation that makes really getting to that context, if you're not careful of how you cultivate your news sources, really difficult.
Eli, I wonder if it's a strategy on the part of the administration. Is he crazy or crazy like a fox? I mean, they know that they're lying basically without consequence. The consequences for telling lies that are clearly provably false lies, like I won the votes of women in the last election, are basically next to nothing. Well, so why stop doing it?
And they all, like management culture starts at the top, right? So if you see the president believes he's getting away with it, and that's his MO. Of course, the people who work for him, in order to please him and say the things, to sort of perpetuate his alternative realities, they say those things. And they also realize that in an era where people's own, idea of truth is completely subjective, that they can get away with that. And I think, in terms of the fact checking, that's just one of the things that we deal with every day. How much to fact check, and I think every time he lies, I talk a lot about these sort of self-fulfilling prophecies that I see around Trump, or that Trump creates. And one of them is with the press. He tells everybody the press is his enemy. Well, every time he's making these false statements, he's almost forcing the press into this tut-tutting mode of, quote, tweet, that's actually not true. And you see it over and over and over again. And what do we look like on the whole? We look like a bunch of arrogant, school-marmish people correcting the president. And that plays into his whole pitch to America, that, you see these elitist, overeducated journalists, they're just always telling you that you're wrong. And it plays into this
Even if
cultural wedge.
you're right, the perception is that somehow you're not behaving in a way that's fair or appropriate.
And I don't think we can sit here and think like, well, if not everybody believes us, I guess we'll just have to stop fact checking. You can't be focused on what is the result, what does the electorate do, where does public opinion move after you release a story. You can't really worry about that.
Yeah.
But it's one of these things that when you're trying to figure out where to spend your energy every day, it makes it difficult, because you feel like this is really important, and you're also conscious of how it's going to be perceived, how it's going to be used against you.
I'm conscious, Yamisha, of Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, when the president started hate tweeting at the press. saying something to the effect of, in response to that, our job is not to go to war with the president, our job is to go to work. Our job is to do more and better journalism and not to engage with this guy. You know, it's got to be hard.
I think it's hard, but it's the job.
Yeah.
There's no other way to do the job but to do the work. I think that's just what you have to do. I think the moment you start thinking too much about this being about you or your personality or what people think about yourself, you lose sight of what the job is. And to me, journalism was something that was outlined in the Constitution. So I feel a great responsibility. And I think a lot of journalists, people who get into journalism, feel a great sense of responsibility. I will say this, though. You were talking about this idea that the president says he's won the vote of women. I would say, as a journalist, there are a lot of times that I'm reading stories or watching people on TV talking about talking about evangelical voters, suburban voters, when they really mean white suburban voters. They really mean white evangelical voters. There are so many times where I think if we're going to say, oh, the president's saying women, we also have to figure out, well, are we also explaining to people what we mean by suburban voters? Because 99% of the time you're talking about white suburban voters.
Yep.
So I think that that's something that, as much as we need to look at what the president's rhetoric is, we should also be looking at the way that we cover politics in general.
Yeah. Kim, you make an excellent point. Does this question, Kim, of what the president says and how he says it on race, to pick an example? I mean, we have two excellent African-American women who are journalists. The president has attacked women. The president has been awful in many instances on the question of white nationalism, on race generally. Is it difficult, as one of a few women of color in the press corps, to regard this president the way you would regard a different president in this environment? Do you have a harder time depersonalizing it or being fair?
That's a good question. I don't believe, my job I see as being fair, and I think I do a pretty good job of that. I don't believe that it is harder for me as a black woman. It is a challenge on the job for a lot of reasons.
Right.
One of which, you're talking about making these claims. If you recall during the campaign, for example, when the president was making his pitch to black voters saying, I believe the quote was, "What the hell do you have to lose?"
Yep.
And then when he talked about any substance about black voters, he talked about Chicago and the crime and how we're going to fix. So what he was actually doing was dog whistling to non-black voters, saying, hey, don't worry, we're going to crack down on these crime-ridden places where these people of color live, and we got you. And it was when, and at that time I was doing commentary on television actually for Fox News, and I would point that out, that this was actually not a pitch to black voters, because that's important when people say, but no, he's reaching out, he's doing outreach to black voters, to say, no, that it is not.
Yep.
The flip side of that, though, is I feel like no matter what I'm covering or what I'm writing about, two things happen. One, there's a certain number of the audience, readers and viewers, who are going to make assumptions about my political leanings or views based on my race and gender. I am not enrolled in any party. I haven't been for a long time. I've covered politics too long, and I've seen how both sides make the sausage. But people don't know that by talking to me. I've done political commentary on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC. I've worked for a conservative newspaper, a more liberal. It's just, you can't really, I do the same job in all of those places. And so that is frustrating, because people will question me or assume that I'm biased just based on my race and gender. It is also frustrating, and as much as I enjoy doing television commentary, is when something happens. I happened to be about to do a hit when he made his comments on Charlottesville. So that was just serendipitous that I had to give my first take of that. But whenever he talks about S-hole countries, when he's talking about issues of race and things like that, I feel like my phone blows up asking me to come in and do commentary on MSNBC. And I get frustrated by that, because the news analysis, the political analysis of what the president is doing, I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to go and talk about that. At one point it was funny. It was actually when the president called my friend Yamiche, said that her question was racist. And I was on TV that whole week. I was in Mexico. Everybody, she went out of town. So then they had to call me to come in and explain this over and over and over again about the president calling this black reporter racist. And That's very frustrating to me, honestly, with all due respect to the producers at MSNBC,
Right.
who I do like. Because that's something that John should be able to give that analysis. That's something that Eli should be able to give that same analysis. And there is, I guess, because there aren't a lot of us sometimes, a default that they will go to turn to us to do. The same thing happened at my old paper at the Herald. If something would happen, I would write like one piece and they would put it against Howie Carr, who was, this white conservative columnist. And it's this pitting against each other, or sort of framing it in a way that's like, I can do Syria analysis too. I can talk about that. I can talk about the Middle East. I can talk about 2020 Dems. It's not always. I don't always have to be the one to explain to the country that the president is doing or saying something racist.
The last time we were together, you and me, Sharon Austin, was right after the president referred to, among other countries, Haiti as a shithole country. And your family is from Haiti, right? You have, and I remember asking you at the time if you felt in some way different because of that in the moment, because you had but I guess we all have to depersonalize the news, do we not?
I think it's the way you do the job. I think the moment, and I think that this is kind of true in every industry. I have friends that are Wall Street bankers. I have friends who are lawyers. There are going to be times in your life as a student for people that people are going to say some things about you that not to be true about yourself, and you can't say, "Well, I give up. I'm not doing this presentation anymore. I'm not gonna be with this client because they said something to me that I found offensive." At the end of the day, I'm there to do the job. I will say that I check my tone, and I have a small group of people like my mom and other people that I'll call if I feel frustrated. I remember when Mark Sanford, when we said something that to me I had to pause and think about, and it was when we were talking about birthright citizenship, and he said something to the effect of Haitian babies shouldn't just be citizens, and that literally is me. Like, I would not be American if it wasn't for me being here, because both my parents were born in Haiti. My dad still lives there. So I had to check my tone and say, like, do I really, like, is this really what I need to give analysis on? Maybe I'm okay on this subject, because to me it's like, well, what am I going to say? I'm not going to say, oh, well, maybe we should look at both of these and really look at those Haitian babies and see if they're worth it. Like, I think they're pretty worth it, right? So I think that, but I think it really is one of those things where if you're fact checking people, there's a way to fact check and say he's an idiot. Look at what he said, and then there's a way to say, let's just look at the substance of what this means and why he's saying this and why this is important. I think that there's a big way that you can check your tone, and I think journalists really should be checking their tone, because I'm not here to be a Black Lives Matter mole, right? Like, I think there are a lot of people who look at me with my natural hair and my afro and say, this girl clearly is an activist who just kind of wiggled her way into these news organizations, and I'm here to say, like, no, I'm not a Black Lives Matter mole.
Okay. Stated as such. We could do more up here, but let's get people from the audience in the conversation.
Yes, there is one here.
And Mallory, I'm going to let you all just tell me when we need to stop, okay? You just give me the Heidi sign. Great. Yes.
Hello, I'm Ivan and I'm from Montenegro. I'm not from America, but I have some question regarding Trump and our profession. It's two questions actually. If Trump says a lie, is it still a news? Because we know that a news has to be truth. And the other question is, if he tells that lie 100 times, is it still a news?
Right. I mean, John, we made the point earlier that if the president says something because he's the president, right, it's news.
Right. I mean,
true or false?
Yes, it is. It has to be covered as news. We have to cover it in a way with context and fact checking and sort of explain why this is not true or it's only partially true, whatever it is. But you also hit on something that he does all the time. He doesn't just tell a lie once; he tells it 100 times, and that's part of what he has always done. And it is what he did on the rally stage every night during the campaign, where he convinces himself, perhaps, but certainly his supporters, of a different truth, of an alternate fact, of a different reality. And they start to believe that. Because he's also painted the media as being biased against him. So therefore, he plants that seed of doubt in people's minds. Well, maybe they're wrong, maybe he is right. One of my favorite Donald Trump facts is, and this predates his career in politics, Trump Tower, his flagship building on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, he listed it as 68 stories tall. It's 58. There's no argument. It's 58. But he skipped 10 floors when he did it. It goes from like floor 2 to 12. And he did it just because he wanted to be, in terms of number of floors, the tallest in that part of Manhattan. And that is something he has carried over with him ever since. And it's our challenge to, when he does that, even though we know there are plenty of people out there who aren't going to believe us, we still need to be the ones to provide that fact check, that context, the actual truth.
Good.
Hi, I'm Sergio from Brazil. I can see like a lot of similarities happening in what's happening now between our two presidents. They like each other very much as well. And I just wonder, there's some talk among Brazilian journalists, like how can we get past all the noise, all the lies they talk about all the time and just focus on the content, all the stuff they say that turns into actual action and policy, which matters the most, right? If he talks about 58 or 68 floors, it doesn't matter as much as building the actual wall and stuff. Like, how can you deal with that?
I mean, Eli, that's been a consistent problem in this administration. You all, I'm sure, done everything you can to focus on stuff that really affects people's lives. But the bullshit does tend to crowd out the substance, does it not?
Yeah, and sometimes you just have to deal with the bullshit. You had to write during the shutdown and after the shutdown when he's talking about we're finishing the wall. We did several stories saying you're not finished, you haven't started it. You know, we had to get to people at, you know, the Border Patrol and to talk to people at Homeland Security and to ask for the actual data on completed wall and money spent and look at budgets and point these things out. So I think if you have to deal with it, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but as Yamiche said, our tone matters a lot because if you're fact checking and correcting, it's important. But I think it's important to do that with evidence. I think it's, you know, to have supporting evidence you can point to and say this is from the government itself, right. And also to do it in a way where you don't seem emotional about it. And just to say, look, this is the reality.
And I think Kim made an excellent point that Twitter sometimes is not the best means for you to police your own tone.
Correct.
Right?
Sure. And yes.
If you're correcting things, for instance, on social media or kind of on the fly, you can often you can solve a problem by creating another problem.
Sure. Yeah, Twitter can be dangerous. And there are some journalists who engage in more, I mean, I will do tweets that I consider analytical, that's not just the who, what, where, and some go even beyond that and really getting into advocacy or other things. It can be a double-edged sword, but I think at the end of the day, the best way to do the best thing that we can do is do the work and show the work. And if the president says climate change isn't real, just show the work, how it is real. If the president says something that is factually wrong, and also give analysis as to why he's saying these things. If he is doing divisive rhetoric, it's because he believes that politically that's advantageous to him because that stirs up his base and that's going to help him win re-election. I think to explain and just put the facts out there and show our work is the best thing that we can do.
Good.
In the middle there and then one behind you, okay?
Let's go from the one behind you maybe to one
hi.
on that. Yes.
You used the phrase that Trump throws these 100 tennis balls at you and you have to go around chasing them. And I was curious, like now that he's been president for so long, have there been instances where you guys have done something different and maybe outplayed him in his game?
I mean, I think I came up with others. I don't think it's mine. I think we've all talked about chasing tennis balls, but I'll take a stab at this. I think, the most obvious thing is his tweets. We all have the Twitter alerts on our phone, and you go back to 2017, we would have, at least in the newsrooms I was in, I think most that I know about, we'd have people who were on to handle early morning tweets because every morning somebody would have to write up that the President of the United States is saying all this crazy stuff on Twitter. And now we just don't do that nearly as much. And so I think, whether it's normalizing or whether it's just sort of the passage of time, I mean, I think we're into year 3 here, and I think you just sort of get used to.
But you still have Twitter. You still have alerts for his tweets on your phone.
I'm sure we all do.
Do you, Yumi?
I do not. I turn them off. No.
I'm like the exact opposite of Kim in that I bought an Apple Watch that buzzes.
It's even worse.
Sounds worse. It's actually unhealthy, but I don't know how to do the job. So I don't know how to do the job without being hyper focused on that, because if he's changing U.S. policy or if he's arguing with North Korea on Twitter, how do you not pay attention
That's
to that?
where he makes policy announcements.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, I obviously look at the feeds, but I just had enough of at 5:30 in the morning being awakened by Donald Trump's tweets. I just couldn't.
And he's also, John, I noticed today, he actually, I mean, not just today, but I noticed today, reminded myself today, he doesn't have a Twitter thread.
Yeah.
But he's also weaponized the ellipsis.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Right? He'll tweet about something and he won't finish his thought, and so there's an ellipsis, and I'm like, come on, what's the next? What's the next?
I mean, he's announcing a major change in U.S. policy, ... 34 minutes later, you're like...
What happened?
where are we going? But it's impossible not to. I mean, I get 2 alerts on my phones. It's Red Sox scores and Donald Trump tweets. I mean, that is, he is still, yes, we can ignore, we've all learned how to handle them better, but you still got to pay attention.
Do you think he knows what he's doing with Twitter? Because as clumsy as he sometimes seems, so I went and looked today at the tweets with the ellipses. I was trying to find the second half of the tweet because when I went to his page, do you have, Mallory, that thing? Can you put that thing up that I sent you? I noticed today that the video of Ilhan Omar, where they've intercut the 9/11 footage with her remarks, I screen grabbed this. I thought he has now pinned that tweet.
Yeah.
So it's one thing for him to simply tweet this video out. It's another thing strategically for him to pin the tweet. I mean, I wonder, does he know what he's doing? Oh, he absolutely sees.
He does, and there have been, he has tweeted far-right groups in the UK and other places, and there have been times where they've tried to explain it away, like, oh, he wasn't quite sure what that was. But there are other times it's very deliberate. This is a great example. But he knows what he's amplifying. He knows what buttons he's pushing. And one topic we haven't really got to yet is the idea that he's weaponized us. That he's placed the media at the center of his story, of his campaign, in an unprecedented way. The idea of the enemy of the people, that we are, the media is labeled that. Not only is that just an extraordinary thing for a president of the United States to say, but it's also a dangerous one. There's been a lot of comments about how her life here is probably, he could be endangering this congresswoman with his rhetoric. But I think there are network reporters who travel with security.
You think he's legitimately endangering all of you?
I think that an argument can be made that is absolutely true. There have been violence against newsrooms, since he has taken office, and there have been people who have tried to carry out threats in his name against his political enemies, who at least have told authorities, law enforcement, that they were inspired by what he had to say.
Well, that bomber, for instance.
Yeah, exactly right.
Again, that's a story that kind of came and went. We don't talk about it. Under normal circumstances, that would have been a much bigger story.
Yeah. With climate change, the press finally decided we're going to stress accuracy, not balance. And I'm curious why the press doesn't say, I will not report something from the president that I know is a lie without correcting it. Why put things in that are simply uncorrected lies?
Well, some of it, I would say, is you have to look at the word report, because showing the president's speech on TV is quote-unquote reporting it, but it's also stuff that's happening on live television. So that would mean that if the decision was made, nothing unless we know it's 100% true, we're not going to report on it. That means you would never be able to take President Trump live. Simply, you would never be able to do that. But the thing is, we would never do that because I think the American people deserve to see the president in all his essence, in whatever he's saying. I also personally believe that when I'm interviewing people, I was once interviewing somebody, and this goes back to the question of race. I was talking to him about healthcare. I was in Wisconsin. I was a Trump supporter, and kept talking to him about health, and he kept saying, well, people think I'm racist. People think I'm racist. And I kept thinking, why is he bringing up race? I almost forgot that I was black for a minute. I was like, well, what could possibly be making him want to talk about race? And then I realized that, I forgot. I'm a black woman asking him these questions. And he said, finally I said, okay, well, why do you think that people think you're a racist? And he said, well, I just think black people don't like to work. And I think all these black women just love to get knocked up by these black men and then have their kids and be on welfare. I put that quote in the story as is. Because I don't need to tell people, well, you know what, black people do like to work. See my byline. No, I don't. I feel like you don't really need to do that, and I really think the country deserves to hear this man say that. So I think that's a voter that doesn't have the power of the presidency. So I think that people deserve to see the president say the things that he's saying, so that we all understand what the president's doing.
And I don't think anybody. I take the premise of the question is that we're reporting what he's saying without correcting it. I don't think that we are reporting what he's saying without correcting it and without giving context. I think we're doing that all the time. I think even when his speeches are carried live, immediately thereafter you see the fact-checking begin. So I think that the press, like I said, I think we're doing a better job at it than we get a reputation.
Well, and some networks have decided not to take him live all the time.
Right.
And
Right.
that's
in fact, fewer and fewer are. In fact, sometimes now Fox, I'm about to say Fox is now not taking.
Not just his rallies, sometimes the things at the White House, they'll say, we'll let you know if he makes
if anything happens.
Anything,
that's a way to fact check him in real time.
Put it up, right.
Professor Alvis is telling us we have one more question, and that'll be your last question.
All right, you guys have touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about Trump and the art of distraction. Example would be last fall, we had the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, and at the same time, Kanye West comes to the White House. So how do you navigate what the shiny object is and avoiding his sort of art of distraction in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple things. I think we as journalists can walk and chew gum at the same time. I think a lot of times when something happens and a big criticism is, well, why are you covering that when you could be covering that other thing? And I'll say, well, if you go to the website of my news organization, you'll see that we covered both things. I think when the President of the United States does or says something as the leader of the free world, it tends to be newsworthy, and I think covering that isn't a bad thing. I will, on the subject of that, I mean, I have written, at the time I was at a newspaper, I have written about Jamal Khashoggi, but I also wrote about Kanye going to the White House in the context of mental health and mental health policy and how this president adores celebrity to the point that he was clearly putting someone in a bad situation and with the White House as a stage. I think it's the way that you cover something and report on something, because those things do have, that has an impact too. Those things have consequences too. But yeah, sometimes he does things to distract. I also think he's accused of doing things as a distraction a lot. That isn't. When he makes comments that are seen as racist or dropping sort of these bombs, then they'll say, oh, well, this race stuff is just a distraction. What he said about Charlottesville is a distraction. No, what he says about Charlottesville and other things and S-hole countries, that's not a distraction. That's a fundamental part of his policy that affects America.
That's who he is. When somebody tells you who they are, believe them, right? That's the old. I mean, John, the fact that something is a stunt doesn't mean it's also not worth covering.
Right, and I think sometimes there are moments where it is clearly a calculation on the White House when there's a bad story coming to throw some smoke up about something else. We certainly saw that time and time again with the response to the Mueller report and everything that Rudy Giuliani did. Other times, though, it's not deliberate. It is just the president being the president. He's an impulsive character who is going to react to what he sees on television, and that doesn't, or whatever his advisor tells him, and it's not necessarily an actual plan to distract. It just sort of happens because that's who he is, because of his lack of discipline in a lot of ways. And I do think news organizations have improved, have gotten better at realizing what stuff we don't need to follow. Okay, this is just him being silly. But to Kim's point, it's 100% right. There's a lot of what he does is illuminating. Even if you feel like this is a distraction, it's like, well, actually, it is something that is worth covering. If he reveals himself, yes, write about it, believe it. Talk about it on television, whatever it might be. It is our job to take what he says, to provide the appropriate amount of context, the appropriate amount of fact-checking. But at the end of the day, he is the President of the United States. We can't just ignore him.
It's a great place to end. Look, we have heard over the last hour and a half how great these folks are at their jobs, and they are four of the most important ones doing it, and they took time to be here. Please give them a big hand, acknowledge the fact that they're here. Thank you all very much. Yamiche, Kim, Eli, and John. Thank you. Good. Thank you so much.
And also, thank you so much for you all to stay here until this time. Thank you for all, this 2 days of kind of celebration of the 20th anniversary. I have never felt so honored, and, I almost had a heart attack yesterday. So, thank you very much. I hope we can meet again next year. ISOJ will be on April 24th, 25th, so towards the end of the semester. And I hope you can come back, and I hope that it's going to be as strong as it was today. Tomorrow we have, for the 12th year, the Iberian-American Colloquium on Digital Journalism. It's an amazing meeting in Spanish. We have about 125 journalists and media executives and scholars from Latin America that will be at that conference tomorrow from 9 to 2 p.m. It's going to be at the Below Center for New Media. And Janine will explain how she's going to give the millions of dollars, because that 1.5 million she got is just the beginning. So thank you very much, and let's see it again.
Times when I really need